3 weeks after Richard Carter's funeral, his family gathered in a law office expecting closure. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. The conference room sat high above downtown Hartford, wrapped in glass and polished wood. The view stretched for miles, but nobody was looking out the windows. Everyone's attention was fixed on the thick envelope sitting in front of attorney Robert Whitmore. Richard Carter had been one of the wealthiest men in the state. He had built Carter Industrial Holdings from nothing: manufacturing plants, commercial real estate, investment portfolios, a fortune that most people could only dream about. But that wasn't why Emily Carter was there. At least, not entirely. She was there because her father was gone. 3 weeks earlier, a late-night phone call had shattered her world. A heart attack. Sudden, unexpected, final. She still found herself reaching for her phone some mornings, expecting to see his name on the screen. Then reality would hit all over again. Across the table sat her younger brother Michael. He looked exhausted, angry. Their Aunt Patricia was scrolling through her phone. Several cousins sat whispering among themselves. And then there was Robert Whitmore. The attorney looked nervous. Not sad, not emotional, nervous. Emily noticed it immediately. The man had represented her father for more than 20 years. She had never seen him like this before. He kept rearranging papers, checking documents, taking slow breaths, like someone preparing to deliver bad news. Very bad news. The room fell silent when Whitmore finally broke the seal on the envelope. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "Before I begin, there is something I need everyone to understand." The statement immediately caught everyone's attention. Whitmore cleared his throat. Richard updated his estate documents approximately 6 months before his passing. Emily frowned. She hadn't known that. Neither had Michael. Her father usually shared important decisions with them eventually. "Why keep this one secret?" Whitmore continued. He was of sound mind when these documents were executed. Michael shifted in his chair. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like." Whitmore's expression tightened. In anticipation of possible disputes, Richard requested extensive documentation confirming his mental competency. The room exchanged confused looks. Possible disputes. What disputes? Emily felt a small knot forming in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Whitmore began reading. The first several minutes sounded normal enough. Charitable donations, specific gifts to longtime friends, personal possessions assigned to family members. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Then he reached the section that changed everything. His voice slowed, almost as if he wished he didn't have to say the words. "The remainder of my estate, including all controlling interests in Carter Industrial Holdings, all commercial properties, all investment accounts, all residences, and all remaining assets shall pass in their entirety to Daniel Brooks." Silence. Complete silence. For a moment, nobody reacted. Nobody seemed capable of reacting. Emily blinked. She was certain she had heard incorrectly. Daniel Brooks. Who was Daniel Brooks? The name meant absolutely nothing to her. Across the table, Michael let out a short laugh. The kind of laugh people make when something is too ridiculous to process. "What?" Nobody answered. Whitmore simply stared down at the page. Michael leaned forward. "What did you just say?" "The estate passes to Daniel Brooks." The room exploded. Questions came from every direction. Voices overlapped. Arguments began instantly. Emily remained frozen. Daniel Brooks. She searched her memory. A business partner. No. A family friend. No. An employee. Nothing. She had never heard the name before in her life. Then Michael stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Who the hell is Daniel Brooks?" Whitmore rubbed his forehead. "Please sit down." "No." Michael's face was turning red. "Answer the question." Instead of answering, Whitmore reached for another document. He anticipated this reaction. That sentence hit Emily harder than anything else. Their father knew. He knew exactly what would happen when the family heard this. And he did it anyway. Whitmore unfolded a handwritten letter. This was written personally by Richard. The room became silent again. Emily felt her chest tighten. Even hearing her father's words secondhand hurt. Whitmore began reading. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone." The words immediately felt personal. Intimate, like Richard was speaking directly to them. "I know many of you will be confused. Some of you will be angry." Whitmore continued. "I did not make this decision lightly. I spent years considering what was right. Years." Emily's attention sharpened instantly. Years? This wasn't some last-minute decision. Her father had been planning this for years. Daniel Brooks is not a mistake. He is not a victim of manipulation. He is not a con artist. Murmurs spread across the room. Whitmore kept reading. "Everything I have done was intentional." Emily felt her stomach drop. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't dementia. This wasn't coercion. Their father had chosen this. Every single part of it. The letter ended with one final request. A request that only created more questions. "Before judging Daniel, learn the truth." Then the room fell silent once more. Nobody knew what to say. Because there was no explanation, no context, no answers. Just a stranger's name and a fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. The argument started again immediately. Aunt Patricia accused Whitmore of withholding information. Several cousins began talking about lawsuits. Others demanded copies of every document. Nobody seemed interested in learning the truth. They wanted someone to blame. Emily couldn't really blame them, because part of her felt exactly the same way. Then Whitmore revealed something else. Something nobody expected. "Mr. Brooks has not yet accepted the inheritance." The room quieted immediately. "What?" Michael asked. Whitmore nodded. He appeared genuinely surprised. Michael scoffed. "Convenient. I'm simply telling you what occurred." And Emily studied the attorney carefully. He wasn't lying. At least, she didn't think he was. In fact, he looked almost as confused as everyone else. That realization unsettled her even more. If Daniel Brooks wasn't a scam artist, if he wasn't manipulating anyone, then why had her father done this? And who exactly was he? Whitmore finally answered at least one question. "Daniel Brooks lives in Vermont." Vermont. Emily frowned. Why Vermont? What possible connection could her father have to a man living hundreds of miles away? "He owns a small woodworking company." The room stared at him. A woodworking company. Not a corporate executive. Not a lawyer. Not a business partner. A carpenter. Michael actually laughed. Only this time there was nothing funny about it. A carpenter inherited $80 million. Whitmore simply nodded. The room erupted again. But Emily barely heard any of it. Because another thought had begun forming. Over the last year her father had changed. Subtle changes. Nothing dramatic. At least not at the time. Long phone calls. Unexpected trips. Private meetings he never explained. Moments when he seemed distracted. Lost in thought. Back then, she hadn't questioned it. Now she wondered if she should have. Maybe the signs had been there all along. Maybe her father had been hiding something. Something enormous. The meeting ended in chaos. By the time Emily reached the parking garage, her head felt like it was spinning. Michael followed her outside. "I'm challenging the will." She wasn't surprised. "Okay. You should too." Emily leaned against her car. "I need time." "Time for what?" "To understand why Dad did this." Michael shook his head. "There is no reason." Maybe he was right. Maybe there wasn't. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. Something important. Something nobody understood yet. After they parted ways, Emily drove home through evening traffic. Her thoughts never left the same question. Who was Daniel Brooks? By the time she reached her apartment, darkness had settled across the city. She dropped her purse on the counter. kicked off her shoes, and stared at a framed photograph sitting on a bookshelf. It showed her standing beside her father on graduation day, both of them smiling, happy, certain. Looking at the picture now felt different, like she was staring at a man she never truly knew. Emily picked up the frame, studied his face, then quietly whispered the question she couldn't stop asking. "Who are you, Daniel Brooks?" As if the universe had been waiting for her to say it, her phone suddenly buzzed. An unknown number. She almost ignored almost. Instead, she answered, "Hello?" For a moment there was only silence. Then a man's voice spoke. Careful, nervous, almost hesitant. "Emily Carter." "Wes?" A pause followed, long enough to make her heart start pounding. Then came the words that changed everything. "My name is Daniel Brooks." Emily froze. Every muscle in her body locked. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. And then Daniel said something she would never forget. "I think we need to talk." If you discovered that your father left everything to someone you've never even heard of, would your first reaction be to fight for your inheritance? Or find out who that person really is? Let me know in the comments. Emily didn't answer right away. For several seconds, she simply stood in her apartment, holding the phone against her ear. The man on the other end of the line remained silent, waiting, giving her time, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. Just an hour earlier, she'd learned that her father had left nearly $80 million to a man she'd never heard of. Now that same man was calling her directly. It felt unreal, like she had somehow stepped into someone else's life. Finally, she found her voice. "How did you get my number?" There was a brief pause. "Your father's attorney." Emily frowned. Of course, that made sense. And yet nothing about this situation felt normal. "What do you want?" The question came out colder than she intended. Daniel didn't seem offended. "If I'm being honest, I don't really know." That wasn't the answer she expected. She had imagined confidence, manipulation, maybe arrogance. Instead, the man sounded exhausted, confused, even nervous. "I thought we should talk." Emily walked slowly toward her living room window. Below, traffic crawled through the city streets. Normal people living normal lives. Meanwhile, her entire world had been turned upside down. "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time, because I think you're probably asking the same question I am. "What question?" "Why your father left me everything." Emily gripped the phone tighter. The answer sounded genuine. Too genuine. "You're saying you don't know?" "No." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't care whether you believe me." His voice remained calm. "I only care whether you're willing to hear me out." Emily didn't respond immediately. Every instinct told her to hang up, to call Michael, to join the lawsuit everyone was already preparing. But another part of her couldn't ignore something. Daniel wasn't acting like someone who had just inherited $80 million. He sounded like someone carrying a problem, not celebrating a victory. Finally she spoke. "Start talking." Daniel exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding his breath. "Your father first contacted me 11 months ago." Emily blinked. 11 months. Not years. Not decades. Less than a year. "How?" "He sent me a letter?" "A letter." "Yes." Emily sat down on the couch. The conversation was already heading somewhere she hadn't expected. "A handwritten letter." Daniel continued. "It arrived at my workshop in Vermont." The workshop. The word immediately brought an image to mind. A small woodworking business. Sawdust. Tools. A completely ordinary life. Nothing remotely connected to billion-dollar corporations. What did it say? Daniel hesitated. It said he wanted to meet me. That's it. Not exactly. Another pause. He said there was something important we needed to discuss. Emily waited. When Daniel didn't continue, she asked the obvious question. "So what happened?" I ignored it. That caught her completely off guard. "What?" "I thought it was a scam." For the first time all day, Emily almost smiled. Almost. Because honestly, she probably would have done the same thing. Then what? He sent another letter. And I ignored that one too. Emily stared at the darkening city skyline. The image of her father repeatedly writing to this stranger felt strange. Personal. Intentional. Almost desperate. Eventually he showed up. What? At my workshop. Emily sat upright. He came to Vermont? Wes. The answer came quietly, without drama, as if Daniel himself still couldn't believe it. He drove 6 hours just to speak with me. Emily tried imagining her father doing that. Richard Carter hated long drives. He flew whenever possible. If he'd driven 6 hours, the meeting must have mattered. A lot. What happened when you met? Daniel laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the memory seemed awkward. Honestly, yes. I thought he was crazy. Emily couldn't help it. A short laugh escaped her. The first one she'd managed since the funeral. Why? Because he started asking questions. What kind of questions? Daniel's voice became thoughtful. The kind of questions only someone investigating a person would ask. Emily listened carefully. Questions about childhood, school, family history, medical records, relationships, old photographs. Every answer created even more confusion. Why would Richard Carter investigate a carpenter in Vermont? Nothing connected. Nothing fit. Then Daniel said something that made Emily's stomach tighten. He asked about my mother. The room suddenly felt quieter. What about her? He wanted to know everything. Emily frowned. Why? I didn't know at the time. A cold feeling spread through her chest. At the time. Meaning Daniel knew now. Or thought he knew. Do you know now? Silence. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Daniel answered. No. Emily wasn't sure she believed him. But before she could press further, he continued. Your father never gave me a clear explanation. That surprised her. What do you mean? He kept saying we needed more time. More time. The words hurt. Because her father had run out of time. A heart attack had made sure of that. What exactly happened during those 11 months? Daniel sighed. We talked. About what? Everything. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Emily sensed there was more. A lot more. But Daniel seemed reluctant to share it. Or maybe he genuinely didn't know where to start. Then he said something unexpected. Your father talked about you. Emily froze. What? He talked about you and Michael. The statement landed harder than she expected. Her father had talked about them. To this stranger. Why? Daniel continued. He was proud of you. Emily swallowed. A lump had suddenly formed in her throat. He told me you became a teacher because you cared more about helping people than making money. She looked down. Her father had said that. Almost those exact words. Years ago. After she turned down a corporate position. He said you were stubborn. A faint smile touched her face. That definitely sounded like Richard Carter. He said Michael was the most loyal person he'd ever met. Emily closed her eyes briefly. For a moment she could almost hear her father's voice. Then reality returned. And with it, the question that refused to go away. Who was Daniel Brooks? Why did he tell you all this? Daniel's answer came softly. I don't know. Emily wasn't sure whether that was true, but she believed he thought it was. The difference mattered. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. By the end of it, Emily knew several things. Daniel Brooks was 41 years old. He lived alone. Owned a woodworking company with 6 employees. Had never been arrested. Had no history of lawsuits. No gambling issues. No criminal record. No obvious reason for Richard Carter to hand him a fortune. In fact, the more she learned about him, the less sense the inheritance made. Eventually, she asked the question she had been avoiding. Did my father ever tell you why he chose you? Silence. Then Daniel said something strange. He gave me a box. Emily frowned. A box? 3 weeks before he died. Her pulse quickened immediately. What was inside? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? It was locked. Emily sat forward. Locked. Where is it now? I still have it. Every instinct in her body suddenly activated. A locked box. Given by Richard Carter shortly before his death. This was the first real clue. The first piece of the puzzle. What did he say about it? Daniel took a deep breath. He told me not to open it unless something happened to him. Emily felt a chill. Something happened to him. As if her father knew. As if he'd been preparing. What happened after he died? I tried to contact him. Daniel's voice grew quieter. That's when I learned he was gone. The sadness sounded genuine. Not performed. Not exaggerated. Real. And somehow that bothered Emily more than anything else. Because if Daniel was grieving, then their relationship had meant something. Something significant. Something nobody in the family knew about. What about the box? She asked. I haven't opened it. Emily nearly dropped the phone. You haven't. Why not? Well, another long pause. Then Daniel answered honestly. Because I'm afraid of what's inside. The answer lingered between them. Afraid. Not excited. Not curious. Afraid. It wasn't the response of someone chasing money. It was the response of someone expecting bad news. Or life-changing news. Emily suddenly realized something. For the first time all day she wasn't angry, confused. Yes. Suspicious. Absolutely. But not angry. Because Daniel didn't sound like an enemy. He sounded like someone trapped inside the same mystery. Someone looking for answers just like she was. Eventually she glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Neither of them had noticed the time passing. What now? She asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made her heart skip. I think we opened the box. Emily stared into the darkness beyond her apartment window. The city lights reflected back at her. 100 thoughts raced through her mind. The smart thing would be to walk away. Let the lawyers handle everything. Let the courts figure it out. But she already knew she wouldn't. Because her father had left behind a mystery, and somewhere inside that mystery was the truth. The truth about Daniel Brooks. The truth about the inheritance. And maybe the truth about the man she thought she knew. When? She asked. Daniel answered immediately. Tomorrow. Emily looked at her father's photograph sitting across the room. For the first time, she felt certain of one thing. Whatever was inside that box, it was going to change everything. The next morning, Emily woke after barely 3 hours of sleep. The moment she opened her eyes, she remembered. The inheritance, the stranger, the phone call, and the box. For several seconds, she remained motionless in bed, staring at the ceiling. Part of her hoped the previous day had been some kind of stress-induced nightmare. It wasn't. Her phone confirmed that immediately. 3 missed calls from Michael. 7 text messages from family members. 2 emails from attorneys. And 1 message from Daniel Brooks. I'll be waiting at Whitmore's office at 10. Emily checked the time. 8:15. 2 hours. 2 hours before she would finally meet the man who had somehow become the somehow of her father's final wishes. 2 hours before they opened the box. By 9:30, she was driving downtown. The weather matched her mood. Gray clouds hung low over the city. Rain threatened from every direction. The entire skyline seemed washed in dull shades of silver and black. When she arrived at Whitmore's office, Daniel was already there. Emily recognized him immediately. Not because she had ever seen him before, but because he stood out. He wasn't what she expected. Not even close. The man sitting in the reception area looked ordinary, painfully ordinary. 41 years old, average height, dark brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, worn jeans, work boots, a navy jacket that looked several years old, no expensive watch, no designer clothes, no signs of someone chasing wealth. If she had passed him on the street yesterday, she would never have looked twice. Daniel stood as she approached. For a moment neither of them spoke. Both seemed unsure how this meeting was supposed to begin. Finally, Daniel offered a small nod. Emily. Daniel. His eyes looked tired. Not the tiredness of a long night. The tiredness of someone carrying something heavy for a very long time. Whitmore appeared from his office moments later. Thank you both for coming. Emily immediately noticed something. The attorney looked almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for this meeting, expecting it. Leading them toward a private conference room, he closed the door behind them. Then he placed a small wooden box on the table. Emily stared at it. The entire mystery suddenly seemed concentrated inside something no larger than a shoebox. The box itself looked old, handcrafted, beautiful in a simple way. Dark walnut wood, brass hinges, no markings, no labels, no clues. Daniel slowly sat down across from her. That's it. Emily nodded. Her pulse had already started quickening. Whitmore took a seat beside them. Richard instructed me to be present when this was opened. Emily looked at him sharply. Expected us to open it together. Whitmore hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The answer sent another chill through her. Her father had planned this. Not just the inheritance, this moment. This exact moment. Months before his death. Whitmore removed a small key from his jacket pocket. Daniel frowned. You had the key. Richard gave it to me. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. The silence stretched. Whitmore finally placed the key beside the box. Whenever you're ready. Daniel looked at Emily. Emily looked at Daniel. Neither moved. The reality of what they were about to do finally hit them. Whatever was inside could explain everything. Or nothing. But there would be no going back afterward. Finally, Daniel reached for the key. His hand hesitated above the lock. Then he inserted it. The click sounded surprisingly loud. Emily felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Daniel slowly lifted the lid. Inside sat a stack of documents, a sealed envelope, and a single photograph. Nobody touched anything immediately. Their attention locked onto the photograph. Because even from across the table, something about it felt important. Daniel picked it up first, then froze. Completely froze. Emily watched the color drain from his face. What is it? Daniel didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the image. Whitmore leaned forward. Emily finally reached across the table and took the photograph from Daniel's hand. The moment she saw it, her stomach dropped. Her father stood in the center of the picture. Much younger, perhaps 30 years younger. His arm wrapped around a smiling woman Emily had never seen before. The woman held the hand of a little boy, a boy no older than 5. The three of them looked happy, comfortable, like a family. Emily's eyes moved slowly toward the child, then toward Daniel, then back to the child. The resemblance hit instantly. The shape of the jaw, the eyes, the expression. The boy looked exactly like Daniel. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The photograph spoke loudly enough. Daniel stared at the table, almost afraid to look at it again. Whitmore finally broke the silence. I've never seen that photograph before. Emily barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on her father, Richard Carter, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize, beside a child who looked exactly like the man sitting across from her. Her mind raced through possibilities. Business partner, family friend, neighbor, godson, anything. Anything except the thought already forming in her head. Daniel looked pale. What does this mean? Emily wished she knew, but she didn't, not yet. Slowly she reached for the sealed envelope. Her father's handwriting covered the front. FOR DENIELANDMILO PINTOGIEHER. The room became silent once more. Emily carefully broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long. The first line immediately made her chest tighten. If you are reading this, then the truth can no longer wait. Daniel swallowed hard. Whitmore leaned back quietly, allowing them space. Emily continued reading. For years I carried a secret that should never have remained hidden. I convinced myself I was protecting people. In reality, I was protecting myself. The next sentence made Emily stop breathing. Daniel Brooks is not a stranger. The room seemed to tilt. Her eyes moved across the words. Slowly, almost unwillingly. Daniel Brooks is my son. Silence, absolute silence. Emily stared at the page. Then read it again, and again. As if the words might somehow change, they didn't. Daniel sat motionless. The photograph remained in front of him. The child, the woman, her father. A family nobody had ever known existed. Emily felt dizzy, confused, angry, heartbroken, everything at once. Her father had a son he had never mentioned, a son he had hidden for decades, a son who had suddenly inherited everything. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then Daniel whispered something so softly that she almost didn't hear it. No. Emily looked up. Daniel's eyes were filled with shock. Pure shock. Not the reaction of a man hearing confirmation. The reaction of a man hearing impossible news. No. He repeated the word, this time louder. My father died when I was 12. Emily stared at him. Daniel shook his head, as if trying to force reality back into place. This isn't possible. But the photograph sat between them, silent, unmovable. And for the first time since Richard Carter's death, Emily realized something. The inheritance wasn't the mystery. The inheritance was the answer. The real mystery had only just begun. Because now they had a far bigger question. If Daniel was Richard Carter's son, why had nobody known? And who was the woman standing beside them in that photograph? The woman whose face had just become the key to everything. Outside the window, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was moving over the city. Inside the conference room, a different storm had already arrived, and it was only getting started. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. The revelation hung over them like a weight. Daniel Brooks is my son. The sentence sat in the center of the table between the photograph and the letter impossible to ignore. Emily stared at the page, then at Daniel, then back at the page. Nothing made sense anymore. Her father had hidden an entire son. Not for months, not for years, for decades. Daniel looked just as stunned, maybe more. The man who had inherited everything didn't look victorious. He looked devastated. Whitmore was the first to speak. I think you should continue reading. Emily glanced down at the remaining pages. Her hands felt unsteady. The familiar handwriting suddenly seemed different, like it belonged to someone she didn't fully know. Taking a breath, she continued. If you are reading this, then I have failed to tell you the truth myself. That is a failure I will regret for the rest of my life. Daniel lowered his eyes. Emily kept reading. Before I met your mother, before Carter Industrial existed, before money and success entered my life, there was Sarah. The name immediately caught both of their attention. Sarah, the woman in the photograph. I loved Sarah Brooks with everything I had. We were young, broke, stubborn, certain that the future would somehow work itself out. Emily had never heard the name before. Richard Carter had talked endlessly about business, friends, investments, history, but never Sarah Brooks. Never, the letter continued. We planned a life together. We planned a future. We even talked about children. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. His eyes never left the page. Then came the next line, and everything changed again. Then everyday Sarah disappeared. Emily stopped reading. What? Daniel looked up. What does it say? She read the sentence again. Then one day she was there. The next day she was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. I searched for months. Then years. Eventually I was told she had moved away and wanted no further contact. I believed it because I didn't know what else to believe. Emily frowned. Something felt wrong. People didn't simply disappear. Not without a reason. Especially not if they were planning a future together. She continued. I married years later, built a company, built a life, but I never completely stopped wondering what happened. Daniel sat motionless. The room had become so quiet that Emily could hear the rain beginning to strike the windows. steady, relentless, like a clock counting down. Then the letter took another turn. 20 years ago, I learned Sarah had died. The sentence landed heavily. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Emily noticed. Even after all these years, hearing it still hurt him. She continued reading. By then I believed every chance to learn the truth had disappeared forever. I was wrong. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. The attorney seemed as invested in the story as they were now. Then came another sentence. The sentence that explained why Richard had spent the last year searching for Daniel. 11 months ago, I received information that changed everything. I learned Sarah had been pregnant when she left. Emily stopped again. Nobody moved. Nobody needed to. The implication was obvious. Richard had only recently discovered that Daniel existed, which meant one thing. He hadn't abandoned a son. He hadn't knowingly ignored him. He hadn't known. Daniel seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. The realization appeared on his face slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. My entire life. He stopped, unable to finish. Emily understood. For years, Daniel had probably imagined dozens of explanations. Maybe his biological father didn't care. Maybe he'd left. Maybe he'd chosen another family. Now he was discovering something else entirely. A man had spent decades searching for answers. Just like he had. Emily continued reading. When I learned the truth, I hired investigators. The investigators found Daniel. The investigators found my son. Daniel lowered his head. His hands had tightened into fists. Emily continued. I cannot describe what it felt like reading that report. I had missed birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduations, every important moment, moments I can never get back. The room remained silent. The words felt less like a letter and more like a confession. Years of regret poured onto every page. Then another paragraph caught Emily's attention. When I first contacted Daniel, he ignored me. A faint smile touched Daniel's face. Despite everything, the details somehow felt familiar. The letter continued. I do not blame him. If a stranger appeared claiming to have answers after 40 years, I would have ignored him too. But eventually he listened. Eventually he agreed to meet me. And eventually I learned something that broke my heart. Daniel never knew I existed. Emily looked up. Daniel stared at the table, lost somewhere in memory. Maybe remembering those first awkward conversations, the meetings, the questions, the confusion. Everything suddenly made more sense. Not all of it, but enough. Then Emily reached the final page, and her stomach tightened, because the tone changed. Immediately. There is one final truth you both deserve to know. Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel. Even Whitmore seemed tense. She continued. Sarah did not leave willingly. The words echoed through the room. Emily read them twice. 3 times. Certain she had misunderstood. What? Daniel whispered. Emily looked down again. The sentence remained unchanged. Sarah did not leave willingly. Richard's handwriting continued below it. Someone convinced her that I no longer wanted her in my life. Someone made sure we never spoke again. Someone spent decades keeping the truth buried. A chill ran through Emily. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad timing. Someone had deliberately separated them. Someone had lied. The question exploded into her mind instantly. Who? The letter answered only part of it. I learned the truth too late, much too late. But the evidence exists. Emily's pulse quickened. Evidence. Actual evidence. Not theories. Not suspicions. Evidence. Then came one final instruction. Inside the envelope is a key. Use it. It will lead you to the answers I never had time to explain. Emily immediately searched the envelope again. Her fingers found something hidden beneath the pages. A small brass key. No label. No explanation. Just a key. Daniel stared at it. So now we have 2 mysteries. Emily nodded. A hidden son and a hidden key. Whitmore looked thoughtful. Nubpo. They both turned toward him. The attorney folded his hands. You have 3 mysteries. What do you mean? Whitmore pointed toward the photograph. The woman. Emily looked down. Sarah Brooks smiled back from 30 years in the past. Young, happy, unaware of the tragedy waiting ahead. Whitmore continued. You know almost nothing about her. He was right. Everything revolved around Sarah. Without her, none of this happened. Without her, Daniel wouldn't exist. Without her disappearance, Richard would have known his son, which meant Sarah wasn't just part of the story. She was the story. Daniel picked up the photograph again. This time he studied it carefully. My mother never talked about him. Emily looked up. Never. Daniel shook his head. Not once. The answer raised even more questions. If Sarah knew the truth, why stay silent? Why hide Richard's existence? Why allow Daniel to grow up believing another man was his father? Unless. The thought hit Emily suddenly. Unless Sarah believed the lie. Unless she genuinely thought Richard didn't want them. The possibility made her chest tighten. Two people separated for decades. Not because they stopped loving each other. Because someone wanted them apart. Daniel seemed to reach the same conclusion. His expression darkened. Who would do that? Nobody had an answer. The rain outside intensified. Water streaked across the glass windows. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Emily looked at the brass key resting on the table. A simple object. Small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. Yet somehow it felt important. Like the first piece of a much larger puzzle. Richard had left it for a reason. The question was where it belonged, and what exactly it would unlock. Daniel carefully placed the photograph back inside the box. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, like a man handling evidence from his own life. Emily understood the feeling, because everything they had learned today had changed the way they viewed Richard Carter. Not as a wealthy businessman, not as a father, but as a man who had spent 40 years living with regret. And judging by the letter, that regret had a name. Sarah Brooks, the woman who disappeared. The woman who had taken the truth with her. The woman whose secrets were still shaping lives decades after she was gone. As the storm continued outside, Emily looked down at the brass key one more time. Somewhere out there, a lock was waiting, and behind that lock, her father believed they would finally find the truth. The key sat on the table for nearly 10 minutes. Nobody touched it. Nobody spoke. After everything they had learned, the small piece of brass seemed almost insignificant. And yet Richard Carter had specifically hidden it inside the envelope. He had wanted them to find it, which meant it mattered. The question was how much. Whitmore was the first to break the silence. I think I know where that key belongs. Emily looked up immediately. You do. The attorney nodded. About 4 months ago, Richard rented a private storage unit. Daniel and Emily exchanged a glance. A storage unit? Daniel asked. Whitmore nodded again. He personally handled all the paperwork. What's inside? I have no idea. The answer wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. Whitmore reached into a folder and removed a document. All I know is that he instructed me to provide the location if either of you discovered the key. Emily stared at him. Her father had planned everything, every step, every clue, almost like he knew they would need a trail to follow after he was gone. The realization felt unsettling, because it meant Richard had anticipated his own death, or at least the possibility of it. Whitmore slid the paper across the table. The address belonged to a storage facility on the outskirts of Hartford, about 30 minutes away. Daniel looked down at the document. Then at Emily. You want to do this today? Emily didn't hesitate. Yes. She wasn't waiting another day. Not after everything they'd learned. Not after discovering that Daniel wasn't a stranger. Not after learning someone had deliberately separated his parents decades earlier. Every answer they uncovered only seemed to reveal 3 new questions. She needed more. The drive to the storage facility was awkward. Daniel followed behind her in his pickup truck. a dark blue Ford that looked as practical and unremarkable as its owner. Neither spoke during the drive. Neither really knew what to say. The situation was still too strange. 24 hours ago, Emily had never heard of Daniel Brooks. Now they were chasing clues left behind by her dead father, trying to solve a mystery that stretched back more than 40 years. Nothing about her life felt normal anymore. The storage facility sat near an industrial area outside the city. Rows of metal buildings stretched across several acres. Rain continued falling steadily as Emily parked near the office. Daniel arrived moments later. Together they entered the reception building. A gray-haired manager greeted them. When Emily explained who they were, the man's expression immediately changed. "You knew Mr. Carter?" Emily nodded. "He was my father." The manager looked surprised, then saddened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." The man glanced toward Daniel. "And you are?" Daniel hesitated. Emily answered before he could. "Family." The word surprised both of them. Daniel looked at her. She avoided his eyes. The explanation was easier than the truth, especially since she still wasn't entirely sure what the truth was. The manager retrieved a file. Mr. Carter visited several times over the last few months. Emily's attention sharpened. Several times. At least 6. That caught her off guard. Whatever was inside the unit had been important enough for repeated visits. The manager pointed toward a row of buildings visible through the rain-covered windows. Unit 87. A few minutes later, they stood outside a large metal door. The number 87 was painted across the front. Everything felt strangely quiet. The rain muffled distant sounds. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. Emily pulled the brass key from her pocket. For a moment, she simply stared at it. This was it. Another piece of the puzzle. Another secret her father had left behind. Daniel stepped beside her. "Readied?" Miku nodded. "Me neither." For the first time, Emily almost smiled. Then she inserted the key. The lock opened immediately. No resistance. No hesitation. Almost as though it had been waiting. Daniel lifted the metal door. The sound echoed through the empty corridor. And then both of them froze. The storage unit wasn't filled with furniture, or business records, or old possessions. It was filled with boxes. Dozens of them. Every single one carefully labeled. The nearest box caught Emily's attention first. Sar, another sat beside it. INVSTIGIOYO. Fiaris, another. Pieto Garapas. Emily stared. Her father hadn't rented a storage unit. He had built an archive. A complete archive. Daniel slowly walked inside. Neither spoke. The sight was overwhelming. Every box represented years, possibly decades. Every box represented answers. The only question was where to begin. Emily chose the nearest container, the one labeled Pho Togare Paches. Carefully lifting the lid, she looked inside. Hundreds of pictures. Hundreds. Many were old. Some faded. Others newer. Daniel moved closer. Together, they began sorting through them. Most featured Sarah. Different ages. Different locations. Different moments. Sarah at a beach. Sarah at a county fair. Sarah sitting beneath a tree reading a book. Sarah laughing beside a lake. The photographs felt personal. Intimate. Like glimpses into a life Richard had never forgotten. Emily had never seen her father this way. The man she knew was disciplined. Focused. Reserved. These photographs revealed something entirely different. A man deeply in love. A man who had spent decades preserving memories. Daniel stopped suddenly. His hand froze above a photograph. Emily looked over. The image showed Sarah holding a young child. Daniel. No older than 3. The date written on the back made Emily's heart sink. Richard hadn't taken the picture. He couldn't have. According to the timeline, he didn't know where Sarah was, which meant someone else had. Somehow, somewhere, her father had obtained photographs of Daniel growing up, without ever meeting him, without ever knowing him. The thought felt heartbreaking. Daniel carefully returned the photograph. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. The emotion was obvious. Then Emily moved to another box. The one labeled INVSTITIO unfiles. Inside were folders, hundreds of pages, receipts, notes, addresses, reports, years of research. Years. Richard hadn't simply searched for Sarah, he had hunted for the truth, for decades. Emily opened one of the folders. The date immediately caught her attention. 23 years earlier. Another file. 19 years earlier. Another. 14 years earlier. The pattern became clear. He never stopped looking. Not once. Even after building a company. Even after becoming wealthy. Even after starting a family. Part of him had always been searching. Daniel sat heavily on a nearby chair. His expression looked distant, lost. Emily understood, because she felt the same way. The image of her father was changing with every file she opened, not disappearing. Just becoming more complicated, more human, more flawed. Then she noticed something unusual. One folder sat separate from the others. Newer, cleaner, recently handled. A single name was written across the tab. Margaret Holloway. Emily frowned. The name meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. She opened the folder. Inside sat a photograph. An older woman. 70s perhaps. Silver hair. Sharp eyes. Beside the photograph rested a handwritten note. Richard's handwriting. The moment Emily read the first line, her pulse quickened. Margaret knows what happened. Find Margaret. She can explain everything. Emily stared at the page. Then read it again. Margaret knows what happened. Daniel stood immediately. What is it? Emily handed him the note. He read it silently, then looked back at her. Neither spoke for several seconds, because both of them understood exactly what this meant. For the first time, they had a living person, not a photograph, not a letter, not a clue, an actual person. Someone who might know why Sarah disappeared. Someone who might know who separated Richard and Sarah. Someone who might know why Daniel spent 40 years believing another man was his father. Emily looked through the folder quickly. An address. A phone number. Medical records. Background information. Everything Richard had gathered. Everything he had left behind. Daniel exhaled slowly. So we found our next lead. Emily nodded. Outside, the storm continued pounding the metal roof. Inside the storage unit, surrounded by decades of secrets, she felt something she hadn't felt since the reading of the will. Direction. For the first time, the mystery wasn't expanding. It was narrowing. Someone knew the truth. Someone had known it for years. And if Richard Carter's notes were accurate, that person was still alive. Emily carefully placed the folder back into the box. Her father's final message echoed through her mind. Before judging Daniel, learn the truth. Now she finally understood what he meant. The truth wasn't hidden inside a will. It wasn't hidden inside a fortune. It was hidden in the past. And that past had a witness. A woman named Margaret Holloway. The next chapter of the mystery wasn't waiting in a document. It was waiting at the end of an address written in Richard Carter's handwriting. And both of them knew exactly where they were going next. The address led them to a small coastal town nearly 2 hours away. Neither Emily nor Daniel spoke much during the drive. The excitement of finding a real lead had faded quickly, replaced by something else. Nervousness, because for the first time since Richard's death, they weren't following documents. They were following a person. A living witness. Someone who might finally explain what had happened all those years ago. Or someone who might destroy everything they thought they knew. The town sat along the Connecticut shoreline. Quiet, peaceful. The kind of place where people waved to neighbors and remembered names. It felt 1,000 miles away from boardrooms and corporate offices. The GPS eventually guided them onto a narrow residential street lined with aging homes. The house they were looking for stood near the end of the block. Small, white, well-maintained. Flower beds surrounded the porch. Wind chimes swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Nothing about the place looked connected to decades of secrets. Emily parked at the curb. Daniel pulled in behind her. For a moment, neither got out. Both stared at the house, both thinking the same thing. This was it. The first real witness. The first real chance at answers. Finally, Daniel opened his door. Emily followed. They walked up the front path together. The closer they got, the harder Emily's heart seemed to pound. Daniel knocked. Nothing. They waited. Then heard footsteps. Slow. Careful. The front door opened. An elderly woman stood before them. Silver hair. Sharp blue eyes. Exactly the woman from the photograph, Margaret Holloway. The moment her gaze landed on Daniel, something changed. Her face lost color. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. A reaction. A recognition. And that told Emily everything. Margaret knew exactly who Daniel was. The woman gripped the edge of the door. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Margaret whispered a single word. Richard. Daniel frowned. My name is Daniel. Margaret blinked. The expression vanished almost immediately. But Emily had seen it. The resemblance. Margaret had mistaken Daniel for Richard. That alone spoke volumes. The woman looked between them. Then sighed. I was wondering when someone would come. Emily felt a chill. You knew we were coming. Margaret stepped aside. No. Her voice sounded tired. Just eventually. The house smelled faintly of old books and tea. Family photographs covered the walls. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. The entire place felt frozen in time. Margaret led them into a sitting room, then carefully lowered herself into a chair. You found Richard's files. It wasn't a question. Emily nodded. Yes. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I told him this day would come. Daniel leaned forward. Did you know my mother? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice was soft. I knew Sarah better than anyone. The room became very still. Daniel swallowed. Emily waited. Margaret studied them carefully, perhaps deciding how much to say, perhaps deciding where to begin. Eventually, she looked toward a photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. A younger version of herself stood beside Sarah. Both smiling. Both happy. The image felt painfully innocent. Margaret noticed Emily looking. That was taken a month before everything fell apart. The statement immediately grabbed their attention. Everything fell apart. Not drifted apart. Not ended. Fell apart. There was a difference. A big one. Daniel spoke first. My mother never talked about Richard. Margaret nodded sadly. I know. Why? The elderly woman looked down at her hands. Age spots covered her skin. Years of life. Years of memories. Years of secrets. Then she finally answered. Because she believed he abandoned her. Silence. Daniel stared. Emily felt her stomach tighten. There it was. The lie. Or at least part of it. Margaret continued. Sarah thought Richard chose another woman. Daniel frowned. What? That's what she was told. Emily immediately sat forward. Told by who? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked slowly toward a cabinet. Opening a drawer, she removed a small wooden box. Not unlike the one Richard had left behind. She carried it back to the table. Then opened it. Inside sat dozens of letters. Yellowed with age. Carefully preserved. Margaret picked up one. Then handed it to Emily. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richard's. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She unfolded the letter. The date at the top nearly stole her breath. 42 years earlier. The letter began simply. Sarah, I don't understand why you won't return my calls. Emily stopped. Then read it again. Sarah, I don't understand why you won't return my calls. Her eyes widened. She looked up. Margaret nodded. Keep reading. Emily continued. I went to your apartment today. Your landlord said you moved. Nobody will tell me where you went. If you're angry, I understand. If I did something wrong, tell me what it was. Just please talk to me. I love you. Richard. Emily lowered the letter. The room felt smaller. Because the letter shouldn't exist. According to Sarah's version of events, Richard had abandoned her. According to Richard's version, Sarah had disappeared. The letter proved one thing. At least one of them had been telling the truth. Richard had tried to find her. Margaret handed over another letter. Then another. Then another. Dozens. Every one written by Richard. Every one searching. Every one begging for answers. Every one apparently unanswered. Daniel sat motionless. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard hadn't left. He had searched. Relentlessly. For years. Margaret watched him carefully. Your mother never received those letters. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Not one. Emily felt another chill. Not one. Someone had intercepted them. Someone had hidden them. Someone had made sure Sarah never knew Richard was looking. Daniel's voice hardened. Margaret's expression changed. The answer clearly wasn't easy. The woman looked toward the window. Toward the ocean visible in the distance. As if gathering strength. Then she spoke. Sarah's father. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily stared. Daniel looked equally stunned. My grandfather. Margaret nodded slowly. Thomas Brooks. The name meant nothing to Emily. But judging by Daniel's expression, it didn't mean much to him either. Margaret continued. Thomas hated Richard. Why? Because Richard was poor. The answer seemed almost absurd, yet somehow believable. Margaret gave a sad laugh. Today people see Richard Carter and think of wealth. She shook her head. Back then he was a mechanic working 2 jobs. Emily tried imagining her father that way. It wasn't easy. Margaret continued. Thomas wanted Sarah to marry someone successful. The pieces began falling into place, one after another, slowly, painfully. He thought Richard would never amount to anything. Daniel looked away. Margaret continued. When Sarah became pregnant, Thomas panicked. The room went quiet again. The words carried enormous weight. He convinced Sarah that Richard had left her. Margaret's eyes filled with sadness. And he convinced Richard that Sarah wanted nothing to do with him. Emily felt sick. The simplicity of it made it even worse. No elaborate conspiracy, no complicated scheme, just lies. Cruel, simple lies. And those lies had stolen 40 years. Daniel stared at the floor. Neither Emily nor Margaret interrupted him. The silence lasted nearly a minute. Then Daniel finally spoke. My mother never knew. Margaret shook her head. No. She believed he abandoned her. Until the day she died. The answer hit like a punch. Daniel closed his eyes. Emily looked away. Because suddenly the tragedy felt enormous. 2 people had loved each other. 2 people had wanted a family. And one man's pride had destroyed all of it. Margaret wiped her eyes. Sarah carried that pain her entire life. The room fell silent once more. Then Emily asked the question that had been growing in her mind. Did Richard ever confront Thomas? Margaret looked at her. The answer came quietly. Yes. Emily leaned forward. When? Margaret's expression darkened. 8 months ago. Daniel looked up immediately. 8 months ago. Shortly before Richard contacted him. Shortly before everything changed. Margaret took a deep breath. Then said something neither of them expected. And that's when Richard learned the truth about Daniel. The room froze. Because suddenly everything connected. The search, the investigation, the letters, the inheritance. Richard hadn't discovered Daniel by accident. Someone had finally confessed, and that confession had changed everything. Margaret lowered her gaze. There is more. Emily's heart sank. Because there always was. Every answer uncovered another layer. Another secret. Another wound. Margaret looked directly at Daniel. Then spoke the words that changed the entire direction of the mystery. Your grandfather wasn't the only person involved. The room became silent. Outside, waves crashed somewhere beyond the shoreline. Inside, 3 people sat frozen. Because if Thomas Brooks hadn't acted alone, then someone else had spent 40 years protecting the lie. And for the first time since this began, Emily realized something. The true villain of the story might still be alive. The room seemed to grow colder. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Margaret Holloway's final words lingered in the air. Your grandfather wasn't the only person involved. Emily felt her pulse quicken. For days, every answer had led to another question, but this one felt different, bigger, more dangerous. Because until now, the story had revolved around a single man, Thomas Brooks, a controlling father who had lied to protect his own vision of Sarah's future. Cruel, selfish, but understandable in a twisted sort of way. Now Margaret was suggesting something else, a second person, a partner, someone who had helped maintain the lie for more than 40 years. Daniel leaned forward. Who? Margaret looked down at her hands. For a moment, Emily thought she might refuse to answer. The elderly woman suddenly appeared exhausted, like someone reopening wounds she had spent years trying to forget. Finally, she spoke. Thomas couldn't have done it alone. Daniel's jaw tightened. Ooh. Margaret sighed. Sarah's older sister. Silence. Daniel stared at her. My aunt. Margaret nodded slowly. Rebecca. The name meant nothing to Emily, but judging by Daniel's expression, it meant something to him. Not much, but something. My mother had a sister, Daniel said quietly. Yes. We weren't close. Margaret gave a sad smile. Neither were they. Emily noticed the wording immediately. Not aren't, weren't. Past tense. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Is Rebecca still alive? Emily asked. Margaret nodded. Very much alive. Daniel looked surprised. I haven't spoken to her in years. Margaret didn't seem shocked by that. In fact, she almost looked like she expected it. Your mother stopped talking to her before she died. Daniel frowned. Why? Margaret stared toward the window. The ocean beyond looked gray beneath the cloudy sky. Then she answered. Because Sarah eventually suspected the truth. Emily sat upright. What? Margaret nodded. Not all of it. Not completely. Hope appeared briefly in the woman's eyes. As the years passed, she began noticing inconsistencies. The word hung heavily in the room. Inconsistencies. The cracks in the lie. The little things that didn't fit. Margaret continued. Sarah never stopped loving Richard. Daniel lowered his eyes. Margaret smiled sadly. I don't think she ever could. Emily thought about the letters. Dozens of them. Every one unanswered. Every one hidden. A lifetime of love locked inside envelopes. A lifetime stolen. Margaret stood and walked toward a bookshelf. After a moment, she returned carrying an old photo album. The cover was worn. The corners faded. It looked like it had been opened 1,000 times. Carefully placing it on the table, she turned several pages. Eventually, she stopped. Emily immediately understood why. A photograph filled the page. Sarah stood smiling beside another woman. The resemblance was obvious. Same eyes, same smile, same dark hair, only older, sharper, more serious. Rebecca Brooks. Daniel stared at the image, then frowned. I barely remember her looking like that. Margaret nodded. Most people don't. Emily studied the photograph carefully. Something about Rebecca bothered her immediately, not because of how she looked, because of how she was positioned. Everyone else in the picture seemed relaxed. Natural. Rebecca looked guarded, controlled, watching. It was only a photograph. Yet somehow Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Margaret noticed. She was always protective of Sarah. Protective. Emily asked. The elderly woman hesitated. Controlling might be a better word. Another piece of the puzzle. Another uncomfortable detail. Daniel leaned forward. Are you saying she helped my grandfather? Margaret's expression darkened. I know she did. The certainty in her voice immediately caught their attention. Not speculation. Not suspicion. Knowledge. How do you know? Emily asked. Margaret opened the album further, then removed a folded piece of paper hidden between the pages. The document looked old, very old. The folds had almost worn through the paper itself. Margaret handed it to Daniel. He unfolded it carefully. His eyes widened. What is this? Margaret's answer came quietly. A confession. Emily immediately looked at the page. The handwriting wasn't Richard's. It wasn't Sarah's. It belonged to someone else. Rebecca, the signature at the bottom, confirmed it. Daniel began reading. The room became silent except for the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the background. His expression changed with every paragraph. Shock, disbelief, anger. Finally, he lowered the paper. His face had gone pale. "What does it say?" Emily asked. Daniel swallowed, then read aloud. "I told Sarah that Richard had left. I told Richard that Sarah wanted nothing to do with him. I believed I was protecting her." The words hit like a hammer. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. "Father convinced me it was the right thing to do. He said Richard would ruin her life. He said Sarah deserved better. I believed him." Emily felt sick. The confession continued. "Years later I realized we were wrong. Terribly wrong. By then it was too late. The damage had already been done." Daniel's voice faltered slightly. "I spent decades wanting to tell the truth. I never found the courage. For that, I will always be sorry." The room fell silent once more. Margaret looked away. Perhaps she'd read the confession 100 times. Perhaps 1,000. The guilt inside those words felt genuine. Yet it changed nothing. 40 years. 40 years because two people thought they knew what was best. Emily couldn't imagine carrying that kind of regret. Daniel carefully folded the paper, then placed it back on the table. His hands were shaking, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Margaret watched him with sadness. "I never forgave Rebecca." Daniel didn't answer. Margaret continued. "Sarah didn't either." Emily looked up. What happened between them? The elderly woman sighed. About 10 years before Sarah died, she started asking questions. The pieces were finally beginning to align. The doubts, the inconsistencies, the growing suspicion. Margaret continued. "Sarah found one of Richard's letters." Daniel's head snapped up. "What?" Margaret nodded. "Just one." Emily felt her pulse quicken. One letter. One tiny crack in a decades-old lie. What happened? Margaret's eyes filled with sorrow. It shattered her. Nobody spoke. Because they understood. One letter would have been enough. Enough to reveal the deception. Enough to reveal the betrayal. Enough to reveal what had been stolen. Margaret looked toward Daniel. "Your mother confronted Rebecca." Daniel stared. And they never spoke again. The answer felt both tragic and inevitable. Family destroyed by lies. Sisters separated by guilt. Parents separated by manipulation. Children growing up without answers. The damage spread through generations. Margaret carefully closed the photo album. The sound echoed softly through the room. Then she looked directly at Daniel. "There is something else." Emily almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because every conversation seemed to contain those same 4 words. There is something else. Always. Margaret reached into the album one final time. This time she removed a photograph. Not an old photograph. A recent one. Only a few months old. The image showed Richard Carter standing outside a restaurant. Beside him stood a woman. An older woman. Silver hair. Sharp eyes. Rebecca Brooks. Emily immediately recognized her from the earlier photographs. Daniel frowned. They met. Margaret nodded. 8 months ago. The same timeline. The same period when everything had begun changing. The same period when Richard suddenly discovered Daniel existed. Margaret pointed toward the image. That meeting lasted almost 4 hours. Emily stared at the photograph. Richard looked serious. Focused, not angry, not emotional, determined. Margaret's voice lowered. That was the day Rebecca finally told him everything. The room fell silent. Emily felt a chill spread through her body, because suddenly she understood. Richard hadn't stumbled across the truth. He'd been handed the truth. By the woman who helped bury it. A confession after 40 years. A confession that allowed him to find Daniel. A confession that explained the investigation. The inheritance. The storage unit. Everything. Then Daniel asked the question nobody had considered. Where is Rebecca now? Margaret looked directly at him. The answer came immediately. 3 towns away. Emily's eyes widened. Daniel sat perfectly still. For the first time since arriving, they had something they hadn't had before. Not a letter. Not a photograph. A destination. A living person. The woman who helped create the lie. The woman who eventually confessed. The woman who might know every missing piece of the story. Margaret slowly stood, then walked toward the window. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Gray water beneath gray skies. Without turning around, she spoke. If you want the rest of the truth. She paused, then looked back at them. You need to talk to Rebecca. Neither Emily nor Daniel replied, because they were already thinking the same thing. Tomorrow they would finally come face to face with the woman who had helped steal 40 years from two people who loved each other. And somehow, Emily suspected the truth was still worse than they imagined. The drive to Rebecca Brooks' house felt different from every journey that had come before it. There was no mystery about where they were going. No uncertainty about who they would meet. For the first time, they were heading directly toward someone who had been at the center of the story from the beginning. Someone who had helped create the lie. Someone who had lived with that lie for more than 40 years. Emily watched the road pass beneath her tires. Daniel followed behind in his truck. The closer they got, the more nervous she became. Not because she feared Rebecca, because she feared the truth. Every answer had hurt. Every revelation had changed something. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst part of the story hadn't been uncovered yet. Rebecca lived in a small town surrounded by forests and farmland. The house sat alone at the end of a winding road. Simple. Modest. Nothing like the home Emily had imagined. She had expected something grander, something colder. Instead, the house looked ordinary, almost lonely. Daniel parked beside her. Neither moved immediately. Finally, he stepped out. So this is it? Emily nodded. This is it. Together they walked toward the front porch. The afternoon sky hung low overhead. Dark clouds drifted across the horizon. The air felt heavy with approaching rain. Daniel knocked, no answer. He knocked again. This time they heard movement inside. Slow footsteps. A lock turning. Then the door opened. Rebecca Brooks stood before them. She looked older than her photographs. Much older. Age had bent her shoulders. Deep lines marked her face, but her eyes remained sharp. Intelligent. Watchful. The moment she saw Daniel, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. As if she had been expecting this day for a very long time. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched. Then Rebecca looked directly at Daniel and whispered the words that immediately told them everything. You look exactly like him. Daniel didn't need to ask who she meant. Neither did Emily. Richard. Rebecca stepped aside. Come in. The house was quiet. Painfully quiet. No television. No music. No signs of visitors. Just silence. The kind that settles over a place where someone lives mostly with their memories. Rebecca led them into a small living room, then sat in an armchair near the window. For a moment, she simply studied Daniel. The resemblance clearly affected her. Finally, she spoke. Richard found you. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. Yes. Rebecca lowered her eyes. A sad smile crossed her face. Good. Emily frowned. The response surprised her. This wasn't the reaction of someone defensive or hostile. It sounded like relief. Rebecca looked toward the window. Rain had begun falling lightly outside. I wondered if he'd have enough time. Daniel leaned forward. You knew he was looking for me. The older woman nodded. I was the one who told him. Silence. There it was. The moment everything changed. Rebecca had confessed. She had finally told Richard the truth. The question was why? And why now? Emily spoke carefully. Margaret said you met Richard 8 months ago. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. Yes. What happened? For several seconds, Rebecca said nothing. Then she laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because some memories become so painful that laughter is easier than tears. He came looking for answers. Daniel remained silent. Rebecca continued. He showed up at my door carrying a box. Emily frowned. A box. Rebecca nodded, filled with letters. The room immediately grew quiet. The letters. The ones Richard had written to Sarah. The ones Sarah never received. Rebecca looked down at her hands. He placed them on my kitchen table and asked me one question. She paused, then repeated it. Why? The word echoed through the room. Simple, direct, powerful. Why? Why destroy two lives? Why separate two people? Why hide the truth? Rebecca shook her head slowly. I couldn't answer him. Daniel's voice hardened, because there wasn't an answer. Rebecca looked directly at him. No. Her eyes filled with regret. There wasn't. The honesty caught everyone off guard. No excuses. No justification. Just regret. Rebecca took a long breath, then finally began telling the story. Sarah was 22 when she became pregnant. Emily listened carefully. Every detail mattered now. Father was furious. Rebecca's voice sounded distant, as though she were speaking from another lifetime. He believed Richard was beneath us. Daniel frowned. Beneath you. Rebecca laughed bitterly. We weren't wealthy. She shook her head. Not even close. The irony seemed to disgust her. My father simply cared about status. Emily thought about Richard, the young mechanic, working multiple jobs, struggling to build a future. It suddenly became easy to imagine why Thomas Brooks had disapproved. Rebecca continued. Father convinced himself he was protecting Sarah. The words sounded familiar. Margaret had said something similar. Only now there was more pain behind them. He told me Richard would abandon her eventually. She swallowed. He told me we needed to save her before it was too late. Daniel looked away. Rebecca noticed. I believed him. The guilt in her voice felt genuine. Painfully genuine. She wasn't defending herself. She was confessing. At first it seemed simple. Rebecca stared toward the rain-covered window. We told Sarah that Richard had changed his mind. Emily felt her stomach tighten. The cruelty of it seemed unbelievable. Yet here it was. Real. We told her he didn't want the baby. Daniel closed his eyes. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly, and she believed us. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavy. Rebecca continued. Then we told Richard that Sarah had left. She looked down. One lie became another, then another, then another, until eventually the truth became impossible to admit. Years passed, then decades. Rebecca shook her head. You tell yourself you'll fix it tomorrow. Her eyes filled with tears. Then tomorrow becomes next week, next month, next year. Eventually you're too ashamed to say anything at all. The room remained silent, because everyone understood, not forgiveness, understanding. There was a difference. Daniel finally spoke. Did my mother ever learn the truth? Rebecca nodded slowly. The answer surprised him. Emily saw it immediately. Yes. Rebecca looked toward an old photograph hanging on the wall. About 10 years before she died. The same timeline Margaret had mentioned. The same hidden letter. The same confrontation. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She showed up at my house carrying one of Richard's letters. Her voice broke. She knew. Daniel stared. Rebecca wiped her eyes. She knew everything. The room fell silent. What happened? Daniel asked quietly. Rebecca looked at him. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then the words finally came. She slapped me. Nobody moved. Rebecca laughed softly through her tears. It was the only time your mother ever hit anyone. Daniel lowered his eyes. Rebecca continued. Then she asked me one question. The older woman paused. Her voice barely above a whisper. How much of my life was a lie? Emily felt her chest tighten. The question was devastating. Because there was no good answer. Rebecca swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. The silence returned. Long, painful, heavy. Then Rebecca looked directly at Daniel and said something that stunned both him and Emily. Your mother tried to find Richard. Daniel's head lifted immediately. What? Rebecca nodded. After she learned the truth, Emily sat upright. This was new, completely new. Did she find him? Rebecca looked away. The answer came quietly. No. The room seemed to deflate. Another tragedy. Another missed chance. Another cruel twist. Rebecca continued. Then Richard had moved several times. Businesses, offices, investments. Success had scattered his life across multiple states. The trail had gone cold. Sarah searched. Richard searched. Neither found the other. Not until decades later. Not until it was almost too late. Then Rebecca reached toward a nearby side table. Her hand trembled slightly. From a drawer, she removed a single envelope. The paper looked old. Carefully preserved. She placed it on the table. Emily immediately noticed the handwriting. Sarah's. Rebecca looked directly at Daniel. I've been waiting 20 years to give you this. Daniel stared at the envelope. His hands remained motionless, almost afraid to touch it. What is it? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears once more. The answer came softly. A letter your mother wrote for you before she died. The room fell completely silent, because suddenly nothing else mattered. Not the inheritance. Not the money. Not the investigation. Not even Richard Carter. For the first time in his life, Daniel was about to hear his mother's voice one last time. And judging by the look on Rebecca's face, whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything. Nobody moved. The envelope sat on the table between them. Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt more important than every document they had uncovered so far. More important than the will. More important than the inheritance. More important than the fortune that had started this entire journey. Because money could answer questions. But this letter carried something else. A voice. The voice of a woman who had been gone for 20 years. A woman whose choices, pain, and secrets had shaped every life connected to this story. Daniel stared at the envelope. His mother's handwriting covered the front. Just 3 words. For my son. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. Emily noticed. Rebecca noticed too. Neither said anything. There were no words for a moment like this. Daniel carefully broke the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as he unfolded it. His eyes moved across the first lines. Then stopped. He swallowed. Hard. For several seconds he couldn't continue. Emily wondered if she should look away. Give him privacy. But Daniel surprised her. Instead of reading silently, he began reading aloud. My dear Daniel. His voice immediately sounded different. Softer. More vulnerable. As though he had suddenly become a little boy again. If you are reading this, then I am gone. The room became perfectly still. I have rewritten this letter more times than I can count. Daniel paused briefly. Then continued. I keep hoping I will find the perfect words. The truth is there are no perfect words. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Tears had already begun forming. Daniel kept reading. There are things I should have told you years ago. I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was protecting myself. Emily felt a familiar ache in her chest. The same regret. The same guilt. It seemed to follow everyone connected to this story. Daniel continued. The man you knew as your father loved you. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. Briefly. He chose you. He raised you. He cared for you. Never let anyone take that away from you. The words felt important. Necessary. Sarah wasn't trying to erase the man who had raised her son. She was honoring him, respecting him. Then the tone of the letter shifted. But there is another truth. Daniel's voice grew quieter. The truth is that Richard Carter is your biological father. Nobody moved. The revelation wasn't new. Yet hearing Sarah herself say it made it feel different. Real, personal. Daniel continued reading. I wanted to tell you. So many times I wanted to tell you. But every time I tried, fear stopped me. Emily watched Rebecca closely. The older woman was openly crying now. Silent tears sliding down her cheeks. Years of guilt. Years of regret. Years of consequences. All sitting in that room together. Daniel read on. When I learned the truth about Richard, I wanted to find him. I spent nearly 3 years searching. Emily exchanged a glance with Rebecca. 3 years. 3 years Sarah had spent trying to reconnect. 3 years Richard never knew about. The tragedy somehow kept growing. Daniel continued. I found old addresses, old business records, old phone numbers. But every trail ended the same way. Too late. The room remained silent except for Daniel's voice. Then came a line that made Emily's heart break. I often wondered if Richard was searching for us too. Daniel stopped reading. For several seconds, he simply stared at the page. Because now they knew. He had been. All those years. All those letters. All those investigations. Both sides had been searching. Neither finding the other. A lifetime lost because of lies. Daniel finally continued. If you ever meet him, tell him I never stopped loving him. The words landed like a punch. Rebecca covered her mouth. Emily looked away. And Daniel simply stared at the page. Because he knew something Sarah didn't. He had met Richard. Too late. But he had met him. And suddenly Emily understood why Richard had changed during that final year. Why he'd driven 6 hours to Vermont. Why he'd spent months trying to build a relationship. Why he'd rewritten his will. Richard hadn't been trying to give away money. He'd been trying to make up for 40 years. An impossible task. But he'd tried anyway. Daniel continued. If you never meet him, that's okay too. Life does not always give us the endings we want. A sad smile touched Rebecca's face. The irony clearly wasn't lost on her. Then Daniel reached the final page. His voice nearly broke. There is one thing I need you to know. You were never unwanted. Not by me. Not by Richard. Not by anyone whose opinion truly mattered. Emily saw Daniel close his eyes, just for a moment, as though those words had struck somewhere deep. Somewhere old, somewhere wounded. The letter continued. Whatever mistakes we made, whatever truths we hid, remember this. You were loved. Always. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the page. Simple, heartbreaking, and beautiful. I am proud to be your mother. Daniel stopped reading. Silence filled the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. The letter rested in his hands. The voice of a woman gone for 2 decades lingering in the air around them. Eventually Daniel folded the pages carefully, almost reverently, then placed them back inside the envelope. Emily noticed tears in his eyes. He didn't hide them, didn't apologize for them, and nobody expected him to. Rebecca wiped her face. She worked on that letter for months. Daniel nodded silently. The room remained quiet. Finally, Emily asked the question that had been growing in her mind. When was it written? Rebecca looked at the envelope. About 6 months before she died. Daniel frowned slightly, then looked back at her. Why didn't you give it to me? The question wasn't angry, just honest. Rebecca looked down, ashamed. I wanted to. The answer sounded painfully familiar. Everyone in this story had wanted to do the right thing eventually. The problem was that eventually kept arriving too late. Rebecca continued. After Sarah died, I couldn't bring myself to face you. Daniel remained silent. Rebecca shook her head. I knew how much pain I had caused. Her voice cracked. I convinced myself you were better off not knowing. Emily almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because that same justification seemed to have destroyed every life in this story. Better off not knowing. The lie that creates bigger lies. The excuse that never works. Then Daniel asked something unexpected. Did my mother know she was dying? Rebecca nodded. Yes. The answer came softly. That's why she wrote the letter. The room grew quiet again. Sarah had known. Known she was running out of time. Known her son deserved answers. Known she might never get the chance to explain them herself. And so she left behind a letter. One final attempt to tell the truth. Then Daniel asked another question. One nobody had considered. Did Richard ever read this? Rebecca immediately shook her head. No. Emily frowned. You never showed him. No. The answer seemed to bother Rebecca, almost as much as the rest of her mistakes. Never knew it existed. Daniel looked down at the envelope. His mother's final words. A message Richard Carter never got to hear. Another missed connection. Another painful coincidence. Then Rebecca stood slowly. Her age suddenly seemed more visible, more pronounced, as though the conversation had exhausted her. She walked toward a nearby bookshelf. After a moment, she returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. Carefully placing it on the table, she removed the covering. A leather journal appeared beneath, dark brown, worn with age. The cover looked decades old. Emily immediately noticed something. Richard Carter's initials. R.C. Daniel frowned. What is that? Rebecca looked directly at him. The answer came quietly. Richard left it here. The room fell silent. When? Emily asked. 8 months ago. The same timeline again. The same meeting. The same confession. Rebecca placed a hand on the journal. He asked me to keep it safe. Daniel stared at it. What is it? Rebecca hesitated, then spoke. It's the diary he kept while searching for Sarah. Nobody moved. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Years of searching, years of investigation, years of heartbreak. Written down, preserved, waiting. Rebecca looked at Daniel, then at Emily. He wrote in it for nearly 40 years. The room became silent once more, because suddenly they understood. The letters told one story. The journal told another, and somewhere inside those pages might be the final pieces they were still missing. Rebecca slowly pushed the journal toward them. There's something in there Richard never told anyone. Emily and Daniel exchanged a glance. Another secret, another truth, another revelation waiting to be uncovered. And judging by the look on Rebecca's face, this one was bigger than all the others. The leather journal felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, emotionally. 40 years of a man's life sat inside those pages. 40 years of questions. 40 years of searching. 40 years of regret. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before finally opening the cover. The first page contained only a date. 41 years earlier. Beneath it, Richard had written a single sentence. Sarah is gone. Nothing else. Just 4 words. Yet Emily felt the pain behind them immediately. The confusion, the disbelief. The beginning of a wound that would never fully heal. Daniel turned another page. Then another. The entries were short at first. Scattered. Almost frantic. I went to her apartment again today. Nobody will tell me where she went. I called every hospital in the county. Nothing. Margaret says she hasn't heard from her. I don't believe that. The handwriting itself seemed different. Messier. Less controlled. Emily could almost picture the young Richard writing late at night. Exhausted. Desperate. Refusing to give up. Page after page revealed the same thing. Searches. Questions. Dead ends. Months became years. Then something changed. The entries grew less frequent. Not because Richard stopped searching, because life kept moving. A new job. A small business. Long hours. Responsibilities. Yet every few months, Sarah's name returned. Always Sarah. Always the search. Always the unanswered question. Daniel turned another page. This entry was dated nearly 15 years later. Today I drove 300 miles chasing a lead. It wasn't her. I don't know why I keep doing this. That sentence hit Emily hard. Because she knew the answer. He kept doing it because he loved her. Simple as that. The journal continued. Years passed. Businesses expanded. Success arrived. Money followed. Yet Sarah never disappeared from the pages. Not completely. Then Daniel stopped suddenly. What is it? Lee asked. He handed her the journal. The entry he had found was different. Much longer. Much darker. The date caught her attention immediately. 20 years earlier. The same year Sarah died. Emily began reading. Today I learned Sarah Brooks is dead. The words felt like a punch. The next lines were even worse. I spent 30 minutes sitting in my car before I could start the engine. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember much of anything. Emily swallowed hard. The grief felt raw even after all these years. The entry continued. She died believing I abandoned her. That thought will haunt me for the rest of my life. Daniel looked away. Neither spoke. The room had become completely silent. Rebecca remained in her chair near the window, listening, watching, remembering. Emily continued reading. If there is any justice in this world, someone will eventually tell me why this happened. The entry ended there. No dramatic conclusion. No answers. Just pain. Pure pain. Daniel slowly took the journal back. The further he read, the quieter he became. Then he stopped again. This time his expression changed completely. Shock. Emily immediately noticed. What is it? Daniel didn't answer. He simply handed her the book. Emily looked down. The entry was dated 8 months earlier. The same period when everything had changed. The same period when Richard met Rebecca. The same period when he learned the truth. Emily began reading. Today I discovered I have a son. The words immediately stole her breath. The entry continued for several pages. Richard described meeting Rebecca, learning the truth, hearing Daniel's name for the first time, reading old photographs, discovering everything that had been hidden. The emotions practically bled from the page. Anger, disbelief, hope, fear, excitement, regret, all mixed together. Then Emily reached a passage that made her pause. I sat in my office for 3 hours staring at a photograph of him. My son. 40 years old and I've never met him. The words felt heartbreaking. Richard continued. I missed every important moment, every birthday, every Christmas, every achievement. How do you make up for 40 years? Emily already knew the answer. You couldn't. No amount of money could do it. No inheritance. No gift. Nothing. The lost time was gone forever. Then she reached the final paragraph. Tomorrow I am driving to Vermont. I have no idea what I'm going to say. The next page contained only one sentence. He ignored me. For the first time all day, Daniel actually laughed. A small laugh. Brief. Unexpected. Rebecca smiled. Even Emily couldn't help smiling slightly. It sounded exactly like Daniel. Richard had spent decades searching, then finally found his son, only to be ignored. The irony was impossible to miss. The journal entries that followed chronicled the next several months. Each meeting, each conversation, each awkward step forward. Emily found herself seeing her father differently with every page. Not as a businessman, not as a wealthy executive, but as a man desperately trying to build a relationship before time ran out. Then Daniel froze again. This time the reaction was immediate, serious, concerned. Emily felt her stomach tighten. What is it? Daniel stared at the page, then slowly turned the journal toward her. A folded document rested between two entries. Something Richard had hidden inside. Emily carefully removed it. The paper looked newer than everything else. Recent. Important. A legal document. The heading immediately caught her attention. Per investigativi reparity. Emily frowned. Richard had hired investigators. That wasn't surprising, but why hide the report? Then she noticed the subject line. Her pulse quickened instantly. Subject, Elizabeth Carter. Emily stared. Elizabeth Carter. Her mother. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Daniel noticed her reaction immediately. What? Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Because her eyes were already moving across the page. And every line felt worse than the one before it. The report wasn't about Sarah. It wasn't about Daniel. It was about her mother. Richard had been investigating his own wife. Or perhaps former wife. The distinction suddenly mattered. A lot. Emily scanned the first page, then stopped breathing. What? Daniel repeated. Emily looked up. Her face had gone pale. Rebecca noticed immediately. Emily. She lowered the report slowly. The words felt impossible. Completely impossible. My mother knew. Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily looked down at the report again, hoping she had misunderstood. She hadn't. The investigator's notes were clear. Multiple witness statements. Financial records. Correspondence. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Elizabeth Carter had known about Sarah. She had known about the deception. And according to the report, she had known for decades. Daniel stared at her. "What are you saying?" Emily's voice barely worked. "I'm saying..." She swallowed hard, then forced the words out. "I'm saying my mother knew exactly what happened to Sarah Brooks." The room fell completely silent. Even Rebecca looked shocked, genuinely shocked. Emily's hands began trembling, because suddenly everything she'd believed about her family was unraveling. Not just her father. Her mother too. The woman she had loved, trusted, mourned. The woman who had died 5 years earlier. A woman who was no longer alive to answer questions, no longer alive to defend herself or explain. Daniel slowly looked at the report, then back at Emily. Neither knew what to say. Because one thing had become painfully clear. Thomas Brooks wasn't the only person responsible. Rebecca wasn't the only accomplice. And the deeper they dug into the past, the closer the mystery was getting to home. You've heard the evidence so far. If you were Emily, would you believe the report immediately? Or would you think there has to be another explanation for her mother's involvement? Let me know what you think before the next chapter. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. The report sat on the table like an unexploded bomb. Emily stared at her mother's name, over and over. Elizabeth Carter, the woman who had packed her school lunches. The woman who had sat through dance recitals and graduations. The woman who had held her hand at her father's funeral. The woman who had died believing her family loved her. And now a private investigator's report was suggesting she had helped hide one of the biggest secrets in Richard Carter's life. It felt impossible, completely impossible. Daniel finally broke the silence. Maybe it's wrong. Emily wanted him to be right. Desperately. But Richard Carter had paid for this investigation. Richard Carter had hidden it inside a journal. Richard Carter had wanted them to find it. That made it difficult to dismiss. Rebecca reached for the report. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages. Then her expression changed. Not guilt. Not recognition. Confusion. Genuine confusion. "I didn't know about this?" Emily looked up. "You've never heard her name connected to any of this?" Rebecca shook her head. "No." The answer came immediately, without hesitation. Emily believed her, at least for the moment. Daniel pointed toward the report. "What exactly does it say?" Emily forced herself to continue reading. The investigator's notes were detailed, painfully detailed. Richard hadn't hired an amateur. Every statement was documented. Every lead followed. Every claim supported. The report suggested that Elizabeth Carter had first learned about Sarah Brooks nearly 30 years earlier. Not 40. 30. Which meant something important. She wasn't involved in the original deception. She entered the story much later. Emily felt a small wave of relief. At least her mother hadn't helped create the lie. But what had she done afterward? She continued reading. Witness interviews indicated Elizabeth became aware of Sarah's existence shortly before her marriage to Richard. Emily frowned. That didn't make sense. Why would Richard hide Sarah from the woman he planned to marry? Then she found the answer. According to the report, he hadn't. Richard had told her. Everything. The relationship. The disappearance. The unanswered questions. The years of searching. All of it. Emily stared at the page. Her father had been honest, at least in the beginning. The report continued. Multiple witnesses described Elizabeth as deeply uncomfortable whenever Sarah's name was mentioned. The sentence immediately caught Emily's attention, because it sounded familiar. Too familiar. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Emily was 12 years old. Her parents were arguing in the kitchen, not loudly, never loudly, but intensely. She remembered hearing a name, a woman's name. At the time it meant nothing. Now she realized exactly what it had been. Sarah. The memory hit so suddenly that Emily physically sat back. Daniel noticed. What is it? Emily shook her head slowly. I think I remember something. Rebecca listened carefully. Emily explained the argument. The name. The tension, the discomfort. As she spoke, another memory surfaced. Then another. Tiny moments. Little fragments she'd never considered important. Her mother changing the subject whenever certain topics came up. Her father becoming unusually quiet. Long silences between them. None of it had seemed significant at the time. Now it felt different. Now it felt connected. Daniel looked thoughtful. You think your mother was jealous? Emily hated the word, but she couldn't dismiss it. Maybe, not of Sarah herself. Sarah had disappeared decades earlier, but perhaps of what Sarah represented. A life Richard never fully let go of. The possibility made her chest tighten. Rebecca quietly nodded. That wouldn't be unusual. Both turned toward her. The older woman sighed. Richard loved Sarah. The statement wasn't judgmental, just factual. Simple truth. He moved on. He built a life. He cared about Elizabeth. The Rebecca paused, then continued. But some part of him never stopped wondering. The room grew quiet, because everyone knew exactly how dangerous that could be inside a marriage. Emily returned her attention to the report. The next section disturbed her even more. Financial records showed multiple payments made by Elizabeth Carter to a private investigator approximately 22 years earlier. Emily frowned. Another investigator? Why? Then she found the answer. The investigator had been searching for Sarah. The same Sarah Richard had spent decades trying to find. Emily blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. Not at all, Daniel noticed. What is it? Emily looked up. My mother hired someone to find Sarah. The room fell silent, because suddenly the story had changed. Again, Daniel frowned. Why would she do that? Emily didn't know. The report offered a possible explanation. Several witnesses suggested Elizabeth intended to locate Sarah and finally end Richard's obsession with the past. The words lingered in the room. End Richard's obsession. Emily thought about that. A wife watching her husband search for answers year after year, watching him carry unresolved grief, watching him wonder. Perhaps she thought finding Sarah would finally bring closure. The theory made sense, until Emily reached the next page. Then, everything changed. Again, a witness statement. A woman named Carol Benson, former assistant to Elizabeth Carter. The statement had been recorded less than a year ago. Emily began reading. Mrs. Carter instructed me to destroy several documents relating to Sarah Brooks. The room first every person. Every breath. Every movement. Gone. Destroyed several documents relating to Sarah Brooks. Emily read the sentence twice. 3 times. Hoping she misunderstood. She hadn't. Daniel leaned forward. What documents? Emily continued. The witness was uncertain. Letters. Addresses. Investigation reports. She could not remember exactly. Only that Elizabeth insisted the material be destroyed. The room became very quiet. Because suddenly 2 completely different versions of Elizabeth Carter existed. One version searched for Sarah. The other buried information about her. Neither made sense. Rebecca looked disturbed. Guilt. Emily looked up. What? Rebecca folded her hands. I've seen it before. The older woman stared toward the rain outside. People do strange things when they're afraid. Emily considered that. Afraid of what? Losing Richard. Learning the truth. Watching the past return. The answer wasn't clear. Then Daniel noticed something. A folded page attached to the back of the report. Smaller. Different. Handwritten. Richard's handwriting. Emily immediately recognized it. Daniel handed it to her. She unfolded the paper. A single sentence sat in the center. I don't believe Elizabeth told me everything before she died. Emily stared. Then read it again. The sentence carried enormous weight. Because Elizabeth Carter had died 5 years earlier. Which meant Richard spent the final years of his life suspecting his wife had hidden something. Something important. Something connected to Sarah. Daniel looked at her. What does it mean? Emily shook her head slowly. I don't know. And she hated that answer. Because for the first time, the mystery felt personal. Not just to Richard. Not just to Daniel. To her. This wasn't some stranger anymore. This was her mother. Her family. Her childhood. Everything she thought she understood. Rebecca stood slowly and walked toward the window. The rain had finally stopped. Gray clouds drifted apart overhead. Sunlight touched the shoreline in the distance. The storm was ending. Outside, at least. Inside, it felt like another one was just beginning. Then Rebecca spoke, quietly, almost to herself. There was one thing that always bothered me. Emily immediately looked up. What? Rebecca turned around. Her expression had changed. She looked uncertain, as though debating whether she should say anything at all. Finally, she did. The last time I saw Elizabeth Carter, she asked me a very strange question. Emily's pulse quickened. When? About a year before she died. The room became silent. What question? Rebecca hesitated, then answered. She wanted to know if Sarah had ever kept a diary. Nobody spoke. The question hung in the air. Unexpected, strange, important. Emily immediately felt it. The significance. Because people don't ask about diaries without a reason. Rebecca continued. At the time, I didn't understand why she wanted to know. Daniel stared. Neither did he. Neither did Emily. But one thing suddenly felt certain. Elizabeth Carter had been searching for something. Something she never found. And whatever it was, it had something to do with Sarah Brooks. A woman who had been dead for 20 years. Yet somehow still held the answers everyone was looking for. For several seconds after Rebecca spoke, nobody said anything. The question echoed in Emily's mind. Had Sarah ever kept a diary? Such a simple question. Yet the more she thought about it, the more important it seemed. Elizabeth Carter had asked that question 1 year before her death, not Richard, not an investigator, Elizabeth. Which meant she had been searching for something. The question was what? Daniel broke the silence first. Did she keep one? Rebecca looked surprised, then nodded slowly. Yes. Emily sat upright immediately. What? Rebecca looked between them. Sarah kept journals for most of her adult life. The room went silent. A diary, actual diaries. Not one, multiple. The realization hit all three of them at once. If Sarah documented her life, if she wrote about Richard, if she wrote about what happened, then those journals might contain answers nobody else possessed. Answers buried for decades. Daniel leaned forward. Where are they? Rebecca hesitated. Not a good sign. Emily immediately noticed. You don't know. Rebecca sighed. I thought they were destroyed. The excitement faded instantly. Destroyed. Another dead end. Another lost piece of history. But then Rebecca shook her head. At least that's what I believed. Emily frowned. What changed? Rebecca walked slowly back to her chair. Then sat down. About 6 months ago, I received a phone call. The timeline immediately caught Emily's attention. 6 months ago. The same period when Richard was investigating. The same period when everything seemed to connect. Who called? Rebecca looked thoughtful. As strange as it sounds. She paused. I don't know. Daniel frowned. What do you mean you don't know? The older woman folded her hands. The caller never gave a name. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Unknown callers rarely led to anything good. Rebecca continued. It was a woman. What did she want? She asked about Sarah's journals. The room froze. Every person, every thought, every breath. Someone else had been looking for the diaries. Not just Elizabeth. Not just Richard. Someone else. Rebecca continued. She seemed convinced I knew where they were. Emily immediately asked the obvious question. Did you? No. The answer came quickly. Without hesitation. Rebecca genuinely seemed frustrated. I hadn't seen those journals in more than 20 years. Daniel looked thoughtful. What happened to them after my mother died? Rebecca frowned. I assumed they were packed away with her belongings. The answer seemed logical. until Emily remembered something. Wu handled the estate. Rebecca looked at her. Then her expression changed, not dramatically, just enough to notice, enough to matter. Rebecca. The older woman stared toward the floor, then finally answered. I did. Silence. Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel. The implications were immediate. Rebecca had handled Sarah's belongings. Rebecca had controlled the estate. Rebecca had access to everything, which meant if the journals disappeared, she was the last known person who had seen them. Rebecca seemed to understand exactly what they were thinking. I didn't take them. Daniel didn't respond. Neither did Emily. Not because they believed she was lying. Because they honestly didn't know. Rebecca sighed heavily. I packed every box myself. Her voice sounded tired, exhausted. I remember the journals. Emily's attention sharpened. You do, Wes. For the first time since mentioning them, Rebecca seemed certain of something. There were 7. 7 journals. 7 volumes of Sarah's life. 7 potential treasure troves of information. What happened to them? Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, then shook her head. I don't know. The frustration in her voice felt genuine. Daniel stood and began pacing. The room suddenly felt too small. Too many clues. Too many unanswered questions. And now 7 missing diaries. Emily understood his frustration, because she felt it too. Then Rebecca suddenly looked up, her expression changing. A memory. Something she had forgotten. Something important. I remember a box. The room instantly became silent. What box? Daniel asked. Rebecca leaned forward. The journals were packed together. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her this mattered. Rebecca continued. Dark green cardboard box. She closed her eyes, trying to remember. The label said personal papers. Daniel stopped pacing, and Rebecca opened her eyes. And I never saw it again. The room fell silent. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Rebecca looked confused herself. I remember packing it. She pointed toward a bookshelf. Then I remember loading it into storage. Another pause. Then she shook her head. After that, nothing. The answer created more questions than it solved. Daniel resumed pacing. Someone took it. Rebecca didn't argue, because the possibility seemed obvious. Emily thought back to the investigator's report. Elizabeth Carter asking about the diaries. The anonymous woman asking about the diaries. Now a box containing 7 journals disappearing. The pattern felt impossible to ignore. Somebody wanted those journals. The question was why? Then Daniel stopped pacing. An idea had clearly formed. Storage. Rebecca looked up. What? You said everything went into storage, Rebecca nodded. Yes. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Where? The room went silent, because suddenly everyone understood. If the box vanished after being placed in storage, maybe it never actually left. Maybe it was still there, waiting. Rebecca stood slowly, then walked toward a desk in the corner. Opening a drawer, she began searching through old papers, receipts, documents, folders, years of accumulated records. Eventually she stopped. I think I have it. Emily stood. Daniel moved closer. Rebecca held up a faded receipt, storage rental agreement, dated 20 years earlier. The facility still existed, only 40 miles away. Emily immediately felt hope, real hope. For the first time in days, Daniel noticed it too. What are the chances? Rebecca gave a sad laugh. Not good. She wasn't wrong. 20 years was a long time. Boxes were lost. Records disappeared. Businesses changed ownership. Yet neither Emily nor Daniel cared, because they finally had a lead. A real lead. Not speculation. Not theory. An actual location. Then Emily noticed something handwritten on the back of the receipt. Different ink. Different handwriting. She immediately recognized it. Richards. Her father had seen this document. At some point. At some time. He had held it in his hands. Emily turned the receipt over. A short note sat beneath the storage information. 3 words. CECKUNITDLV. Her breath caught. Daniel looked over her shoulder. then froze. Richard had been there. Richard had already followed this lead. The realization hit them both instantly. He had found the receipt, found the storage facility, maybe even found the unit, which raised one enormous question. If Richard had already investigated, why hadn't he recovered the journals? Unless, Emily's stomach tightened, unless he never got the chance. Rebecca noticed their expressions. What is it? Emily handed her the receipt. The older woman stared, then slowly lowered it. Richard came here 2 weeks before he died. The room went silent. What? Daniel asked. Rebecca nodded. He asked about Sarah's belongings. Emily's pulse quickened. What did you tell him? The same thing I told you. Rebecca looked at the receipt, then at them. He left excited. The room became very quiet, because suddenly everything connected. Richard had found the lead. Richard had gone looking. Richard had been close, very close. Then he died. Before he could tell anyone what he found. Before he could explain. Before he could finish. Daniel stared at the receipt. Emily did the same. Unit 12. 3 simple words. Yet somehow they felt enormous. Another breadcrumb. Another clue. Another secret left behind. And if Sarah's diaries were still out there, if they had survived 20 years, then somewhere inside those pages might be the final truth. Not Richard's version, not Rebecca's version, not an investigator's version, Sarah's. And for the first time, Emily wondered whether everyone had been asking the wrong question. Maybe the mystery wasn't who separated Sarah and Richard. Maybe the mystery was what Sarah discovered before she died. Because someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure those journals disappeared. And people don't hide the truth unless they're afraid of what's inside. The storage facility looked older than any of them expected. Weathered metal buildings stretched across several acres of land just outside town. Rust-stained portions of the fencing. Several security cameras hung from poles that looked like they belonged to another decade. The place felt forgotten, which made it the perfect location to hide something for 20 years. Emily parked near the office. Daniel pulled in beside her. Rebecca had insisted on coming, despite her age, despite the long drive, despite their objections. She wanted answers too, maybe more than anyone. The facility manager was a man named Carl Simmons, 70 years old. Thin, gray-haired. The kind of person who seemed to know every detail about every tenant who had ever rented a unit. When Emily explained why they were there, Carl disappeared into a back office. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a thick binder. His expression was puzzled. Unit 12. He adjusted his glasses. That's an old one. Emily immediately felt her pulse quicken. How old? Carl flipped through several pages. 20. 3 years. The number sent a wave of excitement through the room. The unit still existed. That alone felt like a miracle. Daniel stepped closer. Is it still active? Carl frowned. Technically. Emily blinked. Technically. The older man nodded. The rental fees were prepaid for 30 years. The room went silent. Nobody had expected that. 30 years. Someone had paid decades in advance. Carl continued reading. The account was opened by Sarah Brooks. Another silence. A heavier one. Sarah herself had rented the unit. Not Rebecca. Not Richard. Sarah. Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel. The significance wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah had chosen to preserve something. The question was what? Carl looked up. You're lucky. Why? Daniel asked. The manager closed the binder. Contract expires next month? Nobody spoke. Emily felt a chill. 1 month. Another month and everything inside might have been auctioned. Lost forever. Destroyed. The timing felt almost impossible. As if fate had waited until the last possible moment. Carl grabbed a ring of keys. Follow me. The walk to Unit 12 felt longer than it actually was. Rows of identical metal doors stretched endlessly around them. Rain from the previous day had left puddles throughout the property. Clouds drifted overhead. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. Nobody spoke. The closer they got, the more nervous Emily became, because for the first time, they weren't chasing clues. They were chasing Sarah herself, her thoughts, her memories, her truth. Finally, Carl stopped. Unit 12. The numbers appeared faded with age. The metal door showed signs of rust. Yet it remained intact, untouched, waiting. Carl inserted a key. The lock clicked. Then he stepped aside. Good luck. Emily wasn't sure why those words unsettled her, but they did. Daniel gripped the handle, took a breath, and lifted the door. The metal rattled loudly as it rose. Sunlight spilled into the darkness beyond. Then all three of them froze. The unit wasn't empty. Far from it, boxes filled the space from floor to ceiling. Furniture, photographs, personal belongings, everything carefully organized, everything preserved. It looked less like a storage unit and more like a life placed on pause. Rebecca covered her mouth. Oh my God. The words barely escaped as a whisper. Daniel stepped inside first, slowly, almost cautiously, like a man entering sacred ground. Emily followed. The air carried a faint smell of dust and old paper. 20 years of silence. 20 years of waiting. Then Daniel stopped. A photograph sat on top of the nearest box. Framed. Protected beneath glass. Sarah smiled back at them. Young. Alive. Emily immediately noticed something. The photograph wasn't random. It had been placed deliberately, centered, visible, almost like a greeting, or an invitation. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. That's her favorite picture. Nobody responded, because nobody knew what to say. Daniel picked up the frame carefully. For a moment, he simply stared, studying a face he had known his entire life, yet somehow seeing it differently now. Not just as his mother, but as a woman with secrets, dreams, regrets. Then Emily noticed another box. Unlike the others, this one carried a handwritten label. Personal Journals. Her heart nearly stopped. Daniel. He turned. Emily pointed. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then all three rushed toward it. The box sat beneath a tarp near the back wall. Dust covered the lid, untouched, undisturbed. 20 years. 20 years and nobody had opened it. Daniel carefully lifted the lid. Inside sat 7 journals. Exactly 7, just as Rebecca remembered. The room became silent. Not one was missing. Every diary had survived. Emily couldn't believe it. Neither could Daniel. The journals sat before them like buried treasure. The missing piece. The thing everyone had been searching for. Richard. Elizabeth. The anonymous caller. All of them. Rebecca stared at the journals, then slowly sank into a nearby chair, as though her legs had given out. Daniel picked up the first volume. The cover was faded blue. Sarah Brooks written neatly across the front. His fingers traced the name. A strange expression crossed his face. Emily understood. This wasn't evidence anymore. This was his mother. Then Daniel opened the first page. The handwriting inside was beautiful. Careful, precise. The opening entry was dated 43 years earlier, months before Sarah disappeared. Emily moved beside him. Together they began reading. Today Richard asked me to marry him. The room immediately went still. The words seemed to echo. Richard had proposed. Neither Daniel nor Emily had known that. Rebecca looked shocked too. Apparently she hadn't known. The journal continued. I said yes before he even finished asking. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face, the first genuine smile Emily had seen from him. Then they kept reading. Page after page revealed pieces of a life nobody had fully understood. Sarah's hopes, Sarah's fears, Sarah's excitement about becoming a mother, her love for Richard, everything. It was all there, real, unfiltered. Then Emily reached an entry dated only days before Sarah disappeared. Her stomach tightened immediately. The tone had changed. Completely. Richard thinks everything is fine. I haven't told him yet. Emily frowned. Haven't told him what? Daniel turned the page. The next entry answered. Father confronted me today. The room became silent again. The familiar villain had returned. Thomas Brooks. Sarah continued writing. He knows about the baby. He says Richard isn't good enough. He says he will never accept him. Daniel's jaw tightened. Emily continued reading. I thought he was bluffing. Now I'm not so sure. The room felt colder, more dangerous. Sarah's fear practically seeped from the page. Then came another entry. Another revelation. Father said something today that frightened me. Emily's pulse quickened. The handwriting seemed shakier here, less controlled. Sarah was scared, genuinely scared. Daniel turned the page. Both of them read the next sentence at the same time. If Richard finds out what father is planning, someone is going to get hurt. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily looked up immediately. Daniel did the same. Neither spoke. Because suddenly the story wasn't about lies anymore. It wasn't about manipulation, or jealousy, or regret. The sentence suggested something far more serious. Something darker. Something nobody had considered. Rebecca stared at the journal. Her face had gone pale. What is it? Emily asked. The older woman looked terrified. Actually terrified. Then she whispered words that sent a chill through the entire room. I remember that. Nobody moved. Rebecca stared at the journal. Lost somewhere decades in the past. Then she looked up and said something that changed everything. Thomas Brooks didn't just lie to separate them. The room froze because Rebecca suddenly looked afraid, not guilty, not ashamed, afraid. And when she finally spoke again, her voice barely worked. He threatened Richard. The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous, and for the first time since this mystery began, Emily realized they might not be uncovering a family secret. They might be uncovering a crime. Nobody spoke. The words seemed to linger inside the storage unit long after Rebecca said them. He threatened Richard. Emily stared at the older woman. Daniel did the same. Because suddenly the story had shifted again. Not dramatically, just enough to change everything. For weeks they had been uncovering lies, manipulation, secrets, family betrayals. Now they were staring at something darker, something far more serious. Rebecca looked shaken, genuinely shaken, the kind of reaction that couldn't be faked. Emily stepped closer. What do you mean he threatened Richard? Rebecca swallowed hard. For several seconds, she seemed unable to answer. Then she slowly sat down. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from age, from memory. I haven't thought about that day in years. Daniel remained silent, waiting. Rebecca looked toward Sarah's journals, then finally spoke. Father found out Sarah was pregnant. Everyone knew that part already. But this felt different, like they were finally approaching the center of the story. The argument happened 2 days later. Emily's pulse quickened. What argument? Rebecca looked directly at Daniel. Between your grandfather and Richard. The room became silent, because nobody had ever mentioned a confrontation before. Not Richard, not Sarah, not Margaret. Nobody. Rebecca continued. I wasn't there. She paused. But Sarah was. Daniel immediately picked up the journal again. If Sarah witnessed it, she might have written about it. Quickly they began searching through the pages. Entry after entry. Date after date. Then Daniel stopped. His finger rested on a paragraph midway through one of the pages. I found it. Emily moved beside him. Together they began reading. Father confronted Richard outside the garage today. The handwriting immediately felt different. Sharper. More emotional. Sarah had been upset when she wrote this. She continued. I followed them because I was worried. The room grew quiet. Everyone listening. Everyone waiting. Sarah described watching from across the street. Hidden. Unseen. Listening. The journal continued. Father told Richard to stay away from me. Richard refused. Emily wasn't surprised. Everything she'd learned about Richard Carter suggested he wouldn't walk away easily. Sarah's entry confirmed it. Richard told him he loved me. That he intended to marry me. That he intended to raise our child. Daniel swallowed. Emily kept reading. Then Father threatened him. The room became silent once more. Every person focused on the page, What kind of threat? Sarah explained. He told Richard that accidents happen. Nobody moved. Emily, read the sentence again. Accidents happen. The words felt cold, calculated, dangerous. Sarah continued. I have never seen Richard afraid before. Today he looked afraid. Daniel slowly lowered the journal. The room felt different now. Heavier. Because the threat suddenly felt real. Not some emotional outburst. Not a heated argument. A deliberate warning. Rebecca nodded slowly. I remember Sarah telling me about it. Emily looked up. You knew. The older woman closed her eyes briefly. Part of it. The answer immediately bothered Emily. Part of it. Another piece hidden. Another piece forgotten. Or ignored. Rebecca continued. At the time I convinced myself Father was bluffing. Her voice cracked slightly. Now I'm not so sure. The silence that followed felt uncomfortable. Because everyone was thinking the same thing. What if Thomas Brooks wasn't bluffing? What if Richard believed the threat? What if Sarah did too? Emily returned her attention to the journal. The next entry was dated the following day. The handwriting looked even more rushed. Even more emotional. Father says he can make Richard disappear. Nobody spoke. The words felt impossible. Yet there they were, written decades earlier, preserved inside Sarah's own journal. Daniel frowned. Disappear. Emily didn't answer. Because she didn't know. The implications were disturbing enough without saying them aloud. Sarah continued. I told Father he was insane. He laughed. That frightened me more than the threat itself. A chill ran through Emily. The detail felt real. Painfully real. The kind of detail people remember because it terrified them. Then the journal took another turn. Sarah wrote about meeting Richard later that evening. A secret meeting. Away from both families. Away from Thomas Brooks. Away from everyone. The entry described two frightened young people trying to figure out what to do. Trying to protect each other. Trying to protect their future. Then Emily found something that made her stop. Completely. Her eyes locked onto a single sentence. She read it once. Twice, 3 times. Certain she had misunderstood. She hadn't. Daniel immediately noticed. What? Emily slowly turned the journal toward him. The sentence sat near the bottom of the page. Simple. Direct. Terrifying. Richard wants us to leave town. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Rebecca stared. Daniel stared. Emily continued reading. He says we should leave this weekend. Get married somewhere else. Start over somewhere Father can't find us. The room remained silent, because suddenly everything fit. The fear, the urgency, the threats. Richard wasn't planning a romantic escape. He was planning an emergency. A way out. Sarah's next sentence confirmed it. I think he's right. Daniel lowered himself into a chair. The realization was hitting him just as hard. His parents had been preparing to run, to leave, to disappear. Together. Then Emily reached the final entry before Sarah vanished. The handwriting looked shaky. Uneven, almost panicked. Something had happened. Something significant. She began reading aloud. Richard never arrived. The room became silent. The sentence felt enormous, terrible. Richard never arrived. Sarah continued. We were supposed to meet tonight. We were supposed to leave. I waited for 3 hours. He never came. Emily felt her pulse racing. Because now she knew exactly what Sarah believed. Exactly what Richard believed. Sarah thought Richard abandoned her. Richard thought Sarah disappeared. Both wrong. Both victims. The question was why. What happened that night? Daniel leaned forward. Keep reading. Emily did. I don't know what happened. Father says Richard changed his mind. Father says Richard left town. Father says he never loved me. The room grew quiet. Because now they knew exactly where the lie began. Not months later. Not years later. That night. The night Richard failed to arrive. The night everything fell apart. Then Emily reached the final sentence. The final sentence before Sarah disappeared from Richard's life forever. I don't believe him. The room became perfectly still. Because Sarah had doubted the lie from the beginning. Some part of her had known. Some part of her had sensed something was wrong, yet it hadn't been enough. The deception still worked. The separation still happened. The decade still vanished. Daniel stared at the journal, his expression unreadable. Emily understood, because she felt exactly the same. For the first time, they weren't looking at the consequences. They were looking at the moment everything broke. The exact moment. The exact night. Then Rebecca suddenly stood. The movement startled everyone. She looked pale, shaken, lost in thought. "What is it?" Emily asked. Rebecca stared toward the far corner of the storage unit, toward another stack of boxes. Old boxes. Unopened boxes. Then her eyes widened, as though she had suddenly remembered something important. Something she should have remembered long ago. Knew. The word escaped as a whisper. Emily frowned. The older woman pointed toward the journals, toward the entry describing the night Richard never arrived. Then she looked at Daniel. Fear filled her eyes. Real fear. "I've been remembering this wrong all these years." The room went silent. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. Rebecca's voice trembled. Richard wasn't the only person who disappeared that night. Nobody moved. The sentence landed like a thunderclap. "What?" Rebecca looked genuinely horrified, as though the memory had only just returned, as though she'd spent decades refusing to think about it. Then she whispered the words that changed everything. "The next morning." She paused, trying to steady herself. The next morning, Thomas Brooks told everyone Richard had been arrested. Emily felt her heart skip. Arrested. Daniel stared. Rebecca nodded slowly. At the time, nobody questioned it. The room became silent, because suddenly they had a brand new mystery, a bigger one, a more dangerous one. Richard never arrived. Sarah disappeared. And according to Rebecca, someone had spread a story that Richard had been arrested. The question wasn't whether it was true. The question was why. And for the first time, Emily wondered if the answer wasn't hidden in the diaries. Maybe it was hidden somewhere else. Somewhere official. Somewhere documented. Somewhere that might still hold records from 40 years ago. Because if Richard Carter had really been arrested that night, there would be proof. And if he hadn't, then somebody had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure Sarah never saw him again. The drive back from the storage facility was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind filled with questions. Questions nobody could answer. Questions that refused to leave. Richard never arrived. Sarah disappeared. And somehow, a story about an arrest had appeared the very next morning. The more Emily thought about it, the less sense it made. If Richard had actually been arrested, there would be records. There would be paperwork. Court documents. Police reports. Something. And if there wasn't, then Thomas Brooks had lied about far more than anyone realized. By the time they returned to Hartford, the sun was beginning to set. Orange light stretched across the skyline. Daniel followed Emily into a small diner near the courthouse district. Neither was hungry. But neither wanted to go home. Not yet. They slid into a booth near the back. Coffee arrived. Neither touched it. Daniel stared out the window. Emily studied her notes. Every clue. Every timeline. Every revelation. The story had become so complicated she needed to see it written down. Finally, Daniel spoke. What if he really was arrested? Emily looked up. The possibility had crossed her mind too. More than once. If he was, we'll find records. Daniel nodded. And if we don't? Emily already knew the answer. Then someone lied. The next morning they were standing inside the Hartford Public Records building. The structure looked exactly like every government office Emily had ever visited. Fluorescent lights. Rows of filing cabinets. A faint smell of paper and dust. Nothing exciting. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow it felt important. Because the truth often hid inside places like this. Not in dramatic confessions. Not in secret meetings. Inside paperwork. Daniel approached the records desk. A middle, Aged clerk listened patiently as they explained what they were looking for. Arrest records, 41 years old. A man named Richard Carter. The clerk frowned. That's a long time ago. Emily nodded. We know. The woman disappeared into a back room. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, she returned carrying several folders. Good news. Emily immediately felt her pulse quicken. There are records. Daniel leaned forward. The clerk opened one folder. Emily held her breath. Then the woman frowned. Actually, finger moved across the page. This doesn't make sense. Emily's stomach tightened. What? The clerk looked up. There was an arrest. The room went silent. Daniel stared. Emily stared. Neither spoke. Because suddenly the impossible seemed possible. The clerk continued. Richard Carter was arrested. Nobody moved. For a brief moment, everything they believed shifted. Then the clerk added 4 words. For unpaid parking tickets. Silence. Then Daniel blinked. What? The clerk adjusted her glasses. It lasted approximately 2 hours. Emily stared. 2 hours. Not days. Not weeks. 2 hours. The clerk continued reading. The incident occurred 11 months before Sarah disappeared. The room immediately relaxed. Not because it was good news, because it wasn't relevant. Wrong arrest. Wrong timeline. Wrong everything. Daniel rubbed his forehead. So nothing. The clerk hesitated. Then looked down again. Not exactly. Emily's attention sharpened. The woman flipped to another document. Then another. Her expression changed. Confusion. Then surprise. What? Emily asked. The clerk slowly turned the folder around. There is another record. The room became silent. The document looked different. Older. Partially damaged. Several sections were difficult to read. The date immediately caught Emily's attention. The exact night Richard never arrived. Her pulse skyrocketed. Daniel leaned closer. What does it say? The clerk frowned. That's the strange part. She pointed to the page. The arrest section was blank. Completely blank. No charge. No explanation. No officer name, nothing. Emily stared. That wasn't normal. Even she knew that. The clerk seemed equally puzzled. This shouldn't exist. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? The woman tapped the document. Someone created the file. She paused. Then removed almost everything. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine, because suddenly this wasn't about missing paperwork. It was about altered paperwork. The clerk continued. There should be supporting records. There. No. The answer came immediately. No booking report. No officer statement. No court appearance. No release paperwork. Nothing. The file existed. Yet the evidence surrounding it did not. Almost as though someone wanted people to believe Richard had been arrested, without leaving enough information to verify it. Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel. They were thinking the same thing. Thomas Brooks. The possibility felt obvious. Too obvious. Then the clerk said something unexpected. This wasn't handled locally. Emily frowned. What? The woman pointed toward a faded stamp, barely visible. Almost impossible to notice. The originating agency wasn't Hartford Police. The room became silent. Daniel leaned forward. Then who? The clerk studied the stamp carefully. For several seconds she said nothing. Then her eyes widened. That's impossible. Emily's pulse quickened again. What is it? The woman looked up. The file came from Raven County. Neither name meant anything to Emily. Neither meant anything to Daniel either. The clerk continued. Raven County Sheriff's Office. Emily frowned. Where is that? A woman typed quickly into her computer. A map appeared. Then her expression changed again. The room suddenly felt very small. You're not going to believe this. Nobody spoke. The clerk turned the screen toward them. A location marker blinked on the map. Daniel stared first. Then Emily. Then both looked at each other. Because they recognized the town immediately. Not from the investigation. Not from the journals. From somewhere else. The location sat less than 20 miles from where Sarah disappeared. 20 miles from where everything fell apart. 20 miles from the last place anyone saw Richard before he vanished. The coincidence felt impossible. The clerk continued searching, then stopped. There's another file attached. Emily felt her heartbeat pounding. Another file. Another clue. The woman opened it. The document appeared on screen. Then everyone froze. Every person, every breath, every thought, gone. Because the file wasn't about Richard Carter. It wasn't about Sarah Brooks. It wasn't about Thomas Brooks. The file belonged to someone else entirely. A deputy sheriff. A man named Walter Green. The same Walter Green who had signed the incomplete arrest report. The same Walter Green who had processed Richard Carter that night. Emily stared at the screen, then noticed something. The file wasn't criminal. It was disciplinary. The deputy had been investigated. Years later, the reason appeared near the bottom of the page. Falsification of official records. The room became silent. Daniel slowly sat back. The meaning hit instantly. Walter Green had a documented history of altering reports, altering evidence, changing official records. The exact thing they were looking at right now. Emily felt her pulse racing. Because suddenly they had more than a mystery, more than a suspicion. They had proof. Someone connected to law enforcement had manipulated records. And that same person happened to be involved in Richard's disappearance. The odds felt impossible. Then the clerk scrolled further down. Another name appeared, a second name, one Emily had never seen before. One that immediately changed everything. Employer reference Thomas Brooks Construction. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly the connection was staring them directly in the face. Walter Green didn't just know Thomas Brooks. He worked for him. For nearly 5 years before becoming a deputy sheriff. The room became silent. The kind of silence that appears when a puzzle finally begins fitting together. Daniel looked at the screen. Then at Emily. Neither needed to say it aloud. Because both were thinking exactly the same thing. Thomas Brooks didn't just spread a lie. He may have had help. Official help. The kind of help that could make a man disappear for a night. The kind of help that could create false records. The kind of help that could convince an entire town that Richard Carter had been arrested. Then Emily noticed something else. One final note at the bottom of the disciplinary file. A witness statement. A statement taken years after the investigation. The witness claimed Walter Green often bragged about one particular job. A job he called the favor. Emily felt another chill. Because suddenly she knew. Deep down she knew. Whatever happened the night Richard never arrived Dole. It wasn't an accident. And somewhere out there, buried beneath 4 decades of lies, was the truth about a favor that changed countless lives. The phrase stayed with Emily all night. The favor. 2 simple words. Yet they felt heavier than everything else they had uncovered. Heavier than the inheritance. Heavier than the journals. Maybe even heavier than the lies. Because favors implied intent. Planning. Cooperation. A favor wasn't something that happened accidentally. Someone asked. Someone agreed. And someone paid the price. The next morning, Emily and Daniel returned to the records building. Neither had slept much. The disciplinary file on Walter Green had opened a door neither of them expected. Now they needed to know what stood on the other side. The same clerk recognized them immediately. I had a feeling you'd be back. Emily managed a tired smile. We need everything you have on Walter Green. The woman nodded. Then disappeared into the archive room. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she returned. This time carrying a thick stack of files. Far more than before. The clerk placed them on a table. Most of this isn't digitized. Emily immediately began sorting through the documents. Employment records. Performance reviews. Training certifications. Complaints. Nothing useful. At least not initially. Then Daniel found something. A newspaper clipping. Small. Yellowed with age. Barely larger than a postcard. He slid it across the table. Emily read the headline. Locale DPY RAR ESIGN as AMD INV Stygit ION. The article wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. Walter Green had resigned before disciplinary action could be completed. No criminal charges. No prosecution. No public scandal. He simply left and disappeared. Emily frowned. That's convenient. Daniel nodded. Very convenient. The article continued. Former colleagues declined comment. Several records relating to the investigation remain sealed. Emily immediately circled the word. Because sealed records usually meant one thing. Someone wanted them hidden. The question was why. Hours passed. Page after page. Document after document. Most led nowhere. Then Daniel froze. Emily noticed immediately. What? Without speaking, he handed her a file. The document appeared ordinary at first. A witness statement. Nothing unusual. Then Emily read the name. Frank Dugan. The witness had worked alongside Walter Green. The statement was recorded nearly 20 years after the original investigation. Emily began reading. Walter used to talk when he drank. The room became quiet. She continued. Most of it was nonsense. Stories, exaggerations, bragging. But there was one thing he mentioned more than once. Emily's pulse quickened. The favor. The statement continued. He said it changed his life. He said it bought him his first house. Emily looked up. Daniel was already staring back. A house. Someone paid him. The implication was obvious. Emily kept reading. Walter claimed he helped a wealthy local businessman solve a problem. The room felt smaller. The words seemed to echo. Solve a problem. Not arrest a criminal. Not enforce the law. Solve a problem. The witness statement continued. He never gave a name, but he always laughed afterward. Then he'd say the same thing. Nobody ever knew. Silence. Absolute silence. Because 40 years later, somebody finally did know. Or at least they were getting close. Emily flipped the page. Another statement. Another witness. This one from a retired dispatcher. The woman described receiving an unusual call on the night Richard disappeared. The date matched perfectly. Emily's pulse accelerated. She began reading aloud. Deputy Green requested temporary detention authorization. Daniel immediately frowned. Temporary detention. The dispatcher nodded in her statement. The request was unusual. No charges. No arrest warrant. No criminal complaint. Nothing. Yet authorization was granted anyway. Emily felt a chill. Because suddenly a picture was forming. A very ugly picture. Walter Green had detained Richard. Not because Richard committed a crime. Because someone wanted him out of the way. The question was for how long? Then Emily reached the next paragraph. The dispatcher specifically remembered the request because Green repeatedly emphasized the detention needed to last until morning. Nobody spoke. Morning. Not forever. Not permanently. Just until morning. Long enough for Sarah to wait. Long enough for Richard to never arrive. Long enough for Thomas Brooks to tell everyone he had left. Emily slowly lowered the paper. The simplicity of it was horrifying. One night. Everything came down to one night. One decision. One favor. Daniel sat motionless. His jaw tightened. His eyes fixed on the documents. The reality was finally becoming clear. His parents weren't separated by fate. They weren't separated by misunderstanding. They were separated deliberately. Someone planned it. Someone executed it. Someone made sure Richard never reached Sarah. The room remained silent. Then Emily noticed something else. A handwritten note attached to the witness statement. Recent. Far more recent. Not 40 years old. Not 25 years old. The note referenced a recorded interview conducted shortly before Walter Green died. Emily's attention sharpened immediately. Died. Daniel looked over. The file confirmed it. Walter Green had died 5 years earlier. Heart failure. Age 74. But before his death, a journalist had interviewed him about corruption allegations from decades earlier. Emily's pulse quickened. The interview transcript was attached. Quickly she turned the page. The journalist's questions appeared first, then Walter's answers. Most were evasive. defensive, unhelpful. Until the final section. The journalist asked directly about the favor. Walter initially denied everything. Then the interview shifted. The journalist mentioned Thomas Brooks. The transcript changed immediately. Walter's responses became shorter, more nervous, more careful. Then came the final exchange. Journalist: did Thomas Brooks ever ask you to interfere in a personal matter? Walter: no comment. Journalist: did you detain Richard Carter? Long pause. Walter: no comment. Journalist: did you prevent him from meeting Sarah Brooks? Another long pause. Then one final answer. Walter: it wasn't supposed to last this long. The room froze. Emily read the sentence again. Then again. Certain she had misunderstood. She hadn't. It wasn't supposed to last this long. Daniel stared at the page, his face pale, his expression unreadable, because those 7 words changed everything. Walter knew. Walter knew exactly what happened. He knew the plan. He knew the consequences. And decades later, he still carried the guilt. The transcript continued. Journalist: what wasn't supposed to last this long? Walter: no further comment. That was it. The interview ended there. The final opportunity for answers gone forever. Walter Green died 3 weeks later. Emily sat back, frustrated, angry, so close, always so close. Then Daniel suddenly stood. The movement startled everyone nearby. What? Emily asked. Daniel pointed toward the transcript. His finger rested on something she'd overlooked. A location. One brief mention buried inside the interview notes. Interview conducted at Ravenwood Veterans Lodge. Emily frowned. So? Daniel's eyes narrowed. Look at the witness list. She did. Then froze. Because attached to the interview was a list of people present. The journalist, the cameraman, Walter Green, and one additional witness, a man named Charles Mercer. The name meant nothing to Emily. At first. Then she saw the description. Former deputy sheriff. Partner to Walter Green during the 1980s. The room became silent. Emily looked up slowly. Daniel was already thinking the same thing. Walter was dead. But his partner wasn't. Charles Mercer was still alive. And if Walter Green helped detain Richard Carter that night, then Charles Mercer might know exactly what happened. Maybe he participated. Maybe he witnessed it. Maybe he spent 40 years carrying the same secret. Either way, he represented something they hadn't had before. A living witness. Someone connected directly to the night everything fell apart. The clerk looked at the file. Then at them. I can probably find an address. Neither Emily nor Daniel responded immediately, because after weeks of chasing ghosts, letters, diaries, and dead ends, they were finally getting close to the truth. Not theories. Not assumptions. The actual truth. The truth about the night Richard Carter never arrived. The truth about the favor. And the truth about the decision that stole 40 years from 2 people who loved each other. For the first time since this journey began, Emily felt certain of something. The mystery was almost over. And judging by what they'd already learned, the final answer was going to be devastating. Charles Mercer lived alone. That was the first thing Emily noticed. The second was that he clearly wasn't expecting visitors. The small house sat at the edge of Raven County, surrounded by tall trees and a rusted wire fence. The property looked neglected, not abandoned, just forgotten. The kind of place a man retreats to when he doesn't want to be found. Which immediately made Emily suspicious. The clerk had managed to locate the address within an hour. By late afternoon, Emily and Daniel were standing outside the front gate. Neither spoke. Both stared at the house, because they knew what this represented. Not another clue. Not another document. A witness. Perhaps the last living witness. A man who might finally explain what happened on the night Richard Carter disappeared. Daniel looked toward the porch. You think he'll talk? Emily was honest. No. Daniel nodded. Neither do I. They walked up the cracked pathway together. The closer they got, the more obvious Charles Mercer's age became. An oxygen tank sat near the front door. A walker rested beside a porch chair. The man living here wasn't running from anyone anymore. Life had already caught him. Daniel knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. This time they heard movement, slow, labored. Footsteps approached the door. Locks clicked. Then the door opened. An elderly man stared back at them. 80 years old at least. Thin, gray-haired. Very tired. His eyes moved from Emily to Daniel. Then stopped, completely stopped. The reaction was immediate, powerful, terrified. Charles Mercer looked like he'd seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the old man whispered 2 words. Richard Carter. Daniel froze. So, did Emily. The resemblance. Again. Just like Margaret. Just like everyone else. Age had changed Daniel. Life had changed him. Yet enough of Richard remained that strangers kept seeing the same face. Charles gripped the doorframe. His knuckles turned white. Daniel finally spoke. My name is Daniel Brooks. The old man's face lost even more color. Because now he understood. Not Richard. Something worse. Richard's son. Charles slowly stepped backward. Then did something neither Emily nor Daniel expected. He opened the door wider. Come in. No hesitation. No argument. No denial. The reaction immediately told them something important. Charles already knew why they were there. The house smelled faintly of medicine and old wood. Family photographs covered the walls. Most showed people Emily assumed were children and grandchildren. Yet none of them appeared recent. The room felt lonely. The way some places do when too much time passes. Charles lowered himself into a chair. The effort alone seemed exhausting. Then he looked directly at Daniel. How much do you know? Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily, then answered honestly. Nuff. Charles gave a tired laugh. That's what I was afraid of. The old man looked toward the window. Sunlight filtered through the trees outside. For a long moment he simply sat there. Silent. Thinking, remembering. Then he spoke. Walter talked too much. Neither Emily nor Daniel interrupted. Charles continued. He always talked too much. The statement sounded more like a confession than an observation. Finally, Emily asked the question. Were you there that night? Charles closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Then nodded. The answer hit like a hammer. Not speculation. Not possibility. Confirmation. He was there. The room became very still. Daniel leaned forward. What happened? Charles looked at him. Really looked at him. For several seconds. Then sighed. Your father never committed a crime. The words arrived immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. A direct answer after weeks of questions. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Charles continued. Richard Carter wasn't arrested. Silence. Absolute silence. Because finally, someone had said it. The arrest was fake. The report was fake. The entire story was fake. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then what happened? Charles looked away. Ashamed. Embarrassed. Disgusted. Perhaps all three. Then he answered. Thomas Brooks paid Walter. Emily wasn't surprised anymore. Not really. Yet hearing it spoken aloud still felt shocking. How much? Daniel asked. Charles laughed bitterly. $5,000. The room fell silent. $5,000. That was it. 40 years of heartbreak. 40 years of separation. 40 years of loss. For $5,000. Charles seemed to understand exactly what they were thinking. His expression darkened. It sounds cheap now. He shook his head. Back then it wasn't. The explanation changed nothing. Daniel looked furious. Emily couldn't blame him. Charles continued. Walter agreed to pick Richard up. Pick him up? Emily asked. The phrase sounded absurd, almost casual. Charles nodded. He stopped Richard on the road outside town. The pieces immediately began falling together. Richard driving to meet Sarah. Walter intercepting him. The fake detention. The missing night. Everything. Charles continued. Walter told him there had been an accusation. What accusation? The old man shook his head. It didn't matter. The answer came quietly. The goal wasn't an arrest. He paused. The goal was delay. Delay. One word. One simple word. Yet it explained everything. Richard only needed to disappear for a few hours. Long enough to miss the meeting. Long enough for Sarah to believe he never came. Long enough for Thomas Brooks to tell his lie. Charles rubbed his face. The memory clearly haunted him. Walter took him to the county station. Daniel stared. And kept him there. Charles nodded. Until morning. Exactly as the record suggested. Exactly as the dispatcher remembered. The story was finally becoming complete. Then Daniel asked the question nobody wanted answered. Did Richard ever find out? Charles looked down. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he nodded. Emily froze. What? Charles looked miserable. He figured it out. The room immediately grew quiet. Richard knew. At least eventually. The question was when, and why he never told anyone. Charles answered before they could ask. Not immediately. He pointed toward the floor. Walter covered his tracks. Of course he did. Everything about this story involved hidden evidence, hidden truth, hidden consequences. Charles continued. Richard spent years believing Sarah left him. The old man paused, then added softly, just like Sarah spent years believing Richard left her. The tragedy felt overwhelming, because the deception had worked perfectly, not forever, but long enough, far too long. Then Charles suddenly stood. The movement surprised everyone. Slowly he crossed the room, opened a cabinet, and removed a small metal box. The sight immediately caught Emily's attention, because she recognized the look on his face, the look people get when carrying something for too long. Something heavy, something painful. Charles returned, placed the box on the table, and opened it. Inside sat a handful of documents, old photographs, yellowed papers, and one cassette tape. Emily stared. Charles looked directly at Daniel. The old man's eyes glistened with regret. Then he said the words that changed everything. Walter gave this to me before he died. The room went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Charles carefully picked up the cassette tape. His hands trembled, not from age, from emotion. Walter made a recording. Daniel stared. A recording. An actual recording. Not a report, not a statement, not hearsay. Walter's own voice. Charles swallowed hard, then finished the sentence. It's his confession. The room became perfectly silent, because after weeks of searching, after decades of lies, the man responsible had finally spoken, and his voice was waiting inside a cassette tape sitting on a table between them. A tape nobody had listened to in 5 years. A tape that might finally reveal exactly what happened on the night Richard Carter never arrived. The cassette player looked ancient. Charles Mercer had to retrieve it from a closet. Dust covered the plastic casing. The batteries had long since died. Eventually he found a power adapter. After several minutes of struggling with cords and connections, the machine finally came to life. Nobody spoke. The room felt too small, too quiet, too tense. The cassette tape sat inside the player, waiting. 40 years of mystery, 40 years of pain, 40 years of unanswered questions, and somewhere on that tape was the voice of the man who helped create it all. Charles looked at Daniel. You sure you want to hear this? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes. The old man nodded, then pressed play. Static filled the room. A crackling hiss. Several seconds passed. Then a voice emerged. Old, weak, tired. Walter Green. If anyone is listening to this though. The recording paused briefly, as though Walter had needed a moment to gather himself. Then I'm probably dead. Nobody moved. The voice continued. I've spent 40 years pretending I wasn't responsible. The room became silent. The confession had begun immediately. No excuses. No denial. Just guilt. Walter continued. I told myself it was only one night. His voice cracked slightly. I told myself nobody would get hurt. Daniel stared at the cassette player, his expression unreadable. Walter continued. I was wrong. 3 simple words. Yet they carried enormous weight. The tape crackled. Then Walter spoke again. Thomas Brooks came to me 3 days before it happened, Emily felt her pulse quicken. Finally. The beginning. The actual beginning. Not theories. Not guesses. The truth. Walter described Thomas arriving at his office. Described the conversation. Described the offer. $5,000. Exactly as Charles had said. The details matched perfectly. Then Walter explained something none of them expected. Thomas didn't ask me to arrest Richard. Emily frowned. Neither Daniel nor Charles interrupted. Walter continued. He asked me to scare him. The room became silent. Scare him. Not arrest him. Not imprison him. Scare him. Walter's voice sounded ashamed. He said Richard was causing problems. The bitterness in his laugh echoed through the speaker. Problems. The word seemed to disgust him. Walter continued. He wanted Richard gone for one night. The exact plan. Simple. Efficient. Cruel. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. The night itself. Walter described stopping Richard on a rural road. Described inventing a reason to bring him in. Described Richard's confusion. His anger. His frustration. Every detail. The story sounded disturbingly ordinary. No violence. No dramatic confrontation. Just authority being abused. One man exploiting a badge. Walter continued. I held him until sunrise. The room remained silent. He kept asking what was going on. Another pause. Then Walter's voice softened. He kept saying he needed to be somewhere. Daniel closed his eyes. The pain behind that statement felt unbearable. Richard knew Sarah was waiting. Knew she was expecting him. And nobody would listen. Walter continued. I remember him looking at the clock. The old deputy's voice cracked. He watched the clock all night. Emily looked away. Because suddenly she could picture it. The young Richard Carter trapped inside a holding room. Watching the hours disappear. Watching his future disappear with them. Then came the moment that changed everything. Walter's voice grew quieter, almost ashamed. I released him at sunrise. The room remained silent. Walter continued. He drove away so fast his tires screamed. Daniel stared at the cassette player, not moving, not blinking. Walter continued. 3 hours later, Thomas Brooks came back. Emily's pulse quickened. Another piece. Another answer. Walter's voice trembled. He smiled. The word felt wrong somehow. Disturbing. Unsettling. He told me it worked. Nobody spoke. Because they already knew what work meant. Sarah believed Richard abandoned her. Richard believed Sarah abandoned him. The lie succeeded. Walter continued. I should have stopped it. The guilt in his voice sounded genuine. Painfully genuine. I should have told someone. Another pause. Long. Heavy. Then Walter said something nobody expected. I tried. The room froze. Emily sat upright. Daniel did too. Walter tried. The confession continued. 2 years later, I tried to tell the truth. Emily frowned. That didn't fit anything they'd discovered. Walter explained. I went to Thomas. The room became silent again. Walter laughed bitterly. A broken sound. He reminded me what happens when powerful men get embarrassed. Emily immediately felt a chill. Powerful men. The phrase stood out because Thomas Brooks wasn't powerful. Not really. Not compared to Richard Carter. Not compared to businessmen, politicians, wealthy investors. Thomas Brooks owned a construction company. Nothing more. Yet Walter sounded genuinely afraid. Then came the line that changed everything. The line that made Emily stop breathing. Thomas wasn't the one calling the shots. Silence. Absolute silence. The tape continued playing. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Walter repeated it. Thomas Brooks wasn't the one behind it. The room felt like it tilted. Emily looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emily. Neither spoke, because suddenly everything they thought they knew was unraveling again. Walter continued. I didn't understand that at first. His voice sounded tired, exhausted, like a man carrying a secret for too long. I thought I was helping a father keep his daughter away from the wrong man. The tape crackled. Then came another sentence. I didn't realize someone else was involved. The room became silent once more. Someone else. Not Rebecca. Not Thomas. Someone new. Someone bigger. Walter continued. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth. Emily's pulse hammered. Who? Who was involved? Who had manipulated everything? The answer didn't come immediately. Walter spent several minutes describing his growing suspicions, conversations, rumors, fragments of information, pieces that didn't fit. Then, finally, he reached the name. The room became perfectly still. Walter's voice dropped almost to a whisper. The person who wanted Sarah and Richard separated wasn't Thomas. Emily stopped breathing. Daniel sat frozen. Even Charles looked stunned. Then Walter spoke the name. Elizabeth Carter. Silence. Nothing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because the impossible had just become reality. Emily stared at the cassette player. Her mother's name echoed through the room. Not Thomas. Not Rebecca. Elizabeth Carter. Walter continued. I didn't believe it either. His voice sounded haunted. At first. The tape crackled again. Walter explained how he discovered the connection years later. A conversation. A witness. Financial records. Pieces that eventually pointed toward the same conclusion. Elizabeth knew about Sarah long before she married Richard. Long before anyone believed she did. The room spun. Emily felt physically ill. Because if Walter was right, everything changed. Again. Walter continued. Thomas hated Richard because he was poor. A pause. But Elizabeth hated Sarah because she loved Richard. The words landed like a hammer. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. The tape continued. Thomas wanted Sarah gone. Another pause. Elizabeth wanted her gone too. Emily stared at the floor. Her mind refused to process what she was hearing. Because it wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Could it? Then Walter said something that shattered the entire room. The night Richard disappeared wasn't the beginning. The tape crackled. Static filled the silence. Then came the final revelation. The plan started 6 months earlier. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly they understood. The separation. The lies. The threats. The fake detention. They weren't spontaneous. They were organized. Planned. Carefully executed. And according to Walter Green's dying confession, Emily's mother had been involved from the very beginning. The tape continued spinning, but nobody heard the next few seconds. Because one thought overwhelmed everything else. If Walter was telling the truth, then the villain they'd been searching for wasn't Thomas Brooks. It wasn't Rebecca. It wasn't even Walter Green. The villain might have been sitting at Emily's family dinner table her entire childhood. And she had never known. Nobody spoke after the tape ended. The silence felt suffocating. Walter Green's confession had changed everything. Again. Emily sat frozen in her chair. Her mother's name echoed endlessly inside her head. Elizabeth Carter. The accusation felt impossible. Cruel. Wrong. And yet the evidence refused to disappear. The tape. The investigation. The destroyed documents. The missing information. The questions about Sarah's diary. Everything pointed in the same direction. Daniel finally broke the silence. One need proof. Emily looked up. The statement immediately grounded her. Because he was right. One confession wasn't enough. Not for something this serious. Not for something that would completely rewrite their understanding of the past. Charles nodded slowly. Walter always believed it. Emily stared at the cassette player. Belief wasn't proof. Suspicion wasn't proof. She needed facts. Something undeniable. Something real. Then Charles spoke again. There was one thing Walter never understood. Both turned toward him. What? Charles pointed toward the metal box. Among the documents sat several folded papers they hadn't examined yet. Walter kept looking for a motive. The old man sighed. But he was asking the wrong question. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Charles picked up one of the folders, then handed it to her. I think Richard figured it out. The room grew quiet. Emily opened the folder. Immediately she recognized the handwriting. Richard's. The documents appeared newer than everything else. Recent notes. Recent research. Recent conclusions. This was Richard's final investigation. The work he'd completed during the last months of his life. Emily began reading. If Elizabeth was involved, the motive wasn't jealousy. The sentence immediately caught her attention. Not jealousy. Then what? She continued. Everyone assumes this was about love. I don't think it was. The room became silent. Because until now, everyone had assumed exactly that. A love triangle. Romantic jealousy. An obsession. Richard apparently disagreed. Emily kept reading. The answer is money. Daniel leaned forward immediately. Money. The theory seemed absurd. 40 years earlier, Richard had been broke. Sarah had been broke. Nobody involved had wealth. What money? Richard's notes anticipated the question. The separation happened before the money existed. The motive appeared after. Emily frowned, then turned the page. The next section explained everything, or at least part of it. Years after Sarah disappeared, Richard unexpectedly inherited ownership shares in a manufacturing company from a distant relative. Emily's eyes widened. She knew this story. The inheritance had been the foundation of everything. The seed money that eventually became Carter Industrial Holdings. Without it, Richard never built his empire. Without it, there was no fortune, no company, no legacy. Richard continued. The inheritance occurred 3 years after Sarah disappeared. The timeline immediately stood out. 3 years. 3 years after the breakup. 3 years after the lies. 3 years after everything collapsed. Emily continued reading. Elizabeth entered my life 6 months later. The room became silent. Because suddenly the timeline mattered. A lot. Richard had become wealthy. Then Elizabeth appeared. The notes continued. I spent years believing it was coincidence. Now I am no longer certain. Emily felt a chill. Because she already knew where this was heading. Richard had spent decades searching for Sarah. Then suddenly stopped. Not completely. But enough. Enough to marry. Enough to move forward. Enough to build a life. Then Richard reached the conclusion that changed everything. I believe Elizabeth knew about the inheritance before she met me. Daniel frowned. So? Emily understood immediately. The implication wasn't romantic. It was financial. Richard continued. If Elizabeth learned Sarah was pregnant, then Sarah represented something dangerous. Emily stared. Dangerous? How? Then she understood. Inheritance. Ownership. Family. Everything. If Richard and Sarah reunited, if they married if they raised their child together, then Elizabeth never becomes Mrs. Carter. The company never becomes hers. The fortune never becomes hers. The life she'd eventually enjoy never exists. The room became silent. Because suddenly the motive felt different. Colder. More calculated. Not love. Opportunity. Daniel slowly sat back. My God. Emily continued reading. The final pages contained Richard's conclusions. Not accusations. Not certainty. Conclusions. Elizabeth learned about Sarah through Thomas Brooks. The two families had business connections long before I met either of them. Emily's pulse quickened. Business connections. There it was. The missing link. Not romance. Business. Thomas and Elizabeth already knew each other. Years before Richard entered the picture. The pieces finally began fitting together. Richard continued. I believe Thomas wanted Sarah separated from me. Elizabeth wanted access to the future she believed I could provide. Their interests aligned. The room became silent. Not because the theory was proven. Because it made horrifying sense. Two different motivations. One shared outcome. Sarah disappears. Richard moves on. Everyone benefits except the people actually in love. Then Emily reached the final page. The final note Richard ever wrote on the subject. The handwriting looks shakier here. Less certain. More emotional. There is one piece of evidence I never found. One piece I know exists. Emily's pulse accelerated. Evidence. Actual evidence. Not theory. Not suspicion. Evidence. Richard continued. Sarah wrote about it in her diary. The room froze. Emily looked up. Daniel was already staring at her. Both understood immediately. The diaries. The missing answer had always been inside the diaries. Richard believed it. Elizabeth apparently believed it too, which explained her questions, her search, her desperation. Emily continued reading. If the diary still exists, it will contain the truth about the meeting. The meeting. A specific meeting, Emily frowned. What meeting? The answer appeared in the next sentence. The meeting between Elizabeth and Sarah 6 months before the disappearance. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily read the sentence again. Then again. Elizabeth met Sarah, personally, face to face, 6 months before everything fell apart. The room felt like it stopped spinning. Because suddenly 100 unanswered questions had an answer. Elizabeth didn't learn about Sarah later. She knew Sarah. She met Sarah. Long before Richard ever suspected anything. Daniel leaned forward. Which diary? Emily immediately understood. 7 journals, hundreds of entries. Somewhere inside them was the answer. The truth Richard never found. The truth Elizabeth spent years trying to locate. The truth that could finally prove what really happened. Then Charles pointed toward the box of journals. His voice sounded almost reverent. Looks like you've got some reading to do. Hours passed. Journal after journal, entry after entry. Sunset arrived. Darkness followed. Still they searched. The storage unit became illuminated by portable lamps. Pages turned, notes accumulated. Coffee disappeared. Nobody complained. Nobody stopped. Because they all sensed they were close. Very close, and shortly after midnight, Daniel froze. Completely froze. Emily noticed immediately. What? He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the page. Emily moved beside him. The entry was dated exactly 6 months before Sarah disappeared. The exact period Richard mentioned. Slowly, Daniel turned the journal toward her. The first line immediately stole her breath. Today I met Elizabeth Carter. The room became perfectly silent. Because after 40 years, after all the lies, after all the secrets, they had finally arrived at the moment that changed everything. And judging by the next few lines, Sarah had written down every word. Nobody spoke. The journal lay open beneath the glow of a portable lamp. Outside the storage unit, the night was completely silent. Inside, 3 people stared at a page written more than 40 years earlier. A page that might finally explain everything. Emily felt her heartbeat pounding. Daniel looked equally frozen. Even Charles Mercer seemed afraid of what they were about to learn. Slowly, Emily began reading. Today I met Elizabeth Carter. The handwriting looked normal at first. Calm, controlled, nothing unusual. Then the next line changed everything. She already knew who I was. The room became silent. Emily continued. She approached me outside the diner near Main Street. At first I thought she was lost. Then she introduced herself. She said she knew Richard. Daniel leaned forward. The words seemed to pull everyone deeper into the past. Sarah continued writing. She was polite, friendly, beautiful, confident. The kind of woman who never doubts herself. Emily swallowed. The description felt strangely painful, because Sarah wasn't describing a villain. She was describing a person. A real person. Someone complicated. Someone human. Then the entry took a darker turn. She asked if Richard and I were serious. I told her we were planning to get married. The room grew quiet. Emily kept reading. Something changed in her expression when I said that. I noticed it immediately. A smile that wasn't really a smile. The kind people wear when they're hiding disappointment. Emily looked at Daniel. Neither said anything. The journal continued. She asked about our future. She asked about children. She asked whether Richard knew I was pregnant. The questions felt oddly specific, almost investigative. Sarah apparently noticed too. Because her next sentence reflected exactly that. The conversation felt strange. Like she wasn't gathering information. Like she was confirming something she already knew. The room remained silent. Then came the part Richard had spent years searching for. The part Elizabeth had spent years trying to find. The truth about the meeting. Sarah wrote before she left, Elizabeth gave me a photograph. Emily stopped. Daniel looked up. A photograph. Not a threat. Not an argument. A photograph. Sarah continued. It showed Richard standing beside another woman. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Another woman. Then she continued reading. Elizabeth told me Richard had been seeing her for months. Silence. Absolute silence. The journal entry continued. She said she thought I deserved to know. She said Richard planned to leave me eventually. She said men like Richard always choose money over responsibility. Daniel lowered his head. The cruelty felt deliberate. Calculated. Precise. Not a direct attack. A seed. A doubt. A fear. Sarah continued. I wanted to believe she was lying. But the photograph looked real. The room remained silent. Because now they understood. Not everything. But enough. Elizabeth hadn't physically separated Richard and Sarah. She'd begun weakening the relationship months earlier, creating uncertainty, creating distrust, creating cracks. Then Thomas Brooks and Walter Green finished the job. Sarah continued. I asked her why she was telling me this. She smiled, then said something I will never forget. Emily felt her breath catch. The next line sat alone on the page. Because nobody wants to be the last person to learn the truth. The room became silent. The statement sounded innocent, helpful even. Yet everyone knew what it really was. Manipulation. Carefully disguised manipulation. Then Emily continued reading. After she left, I stared at the photograph for hours. I wanted to throw it away. Instead, I hid it. The room immediately became still. Daniel looked up. Emily looked up. Both thinking the same thing. The photograph. The actual photograph. Sarah had hidden it, which meant it might still exist. Then came the sentence that changed everything. I placed it inside Mother's jewelry box. The room froze. Emily stared, reread the line. Mother's jewelry box. Not destroyed. Not lost. Hidden. Daniel sat upright. Do we know where that is? Rebecca answered from the back of the room, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Everyone turned. The older woman looked stunned, almost frightened. Sarah inherited it from our mother. Emily's pulse accelerated. What happened to it? Rebecca stared into space. Lost in memory. Then slowly answered. It went into storage. The room became silent, because suddenly they understood. The jewelry box might still be here. Inside the unit. Inside one of the hundreds of containers surrounding them. Daniel stood immediately. Emily followed. For the next hour, nobody spoke. Boxes opened. Drawers searched. Containers moved. Dust filled the air. The storage unit transformed into a maze of scattered belongings. Then Daniel found it. A small wooden jewelry box. Dark mahogany. Hand carved. Beautiful. Exactly where Rebecca remembered. Inside an old dresser. Wrapped carefully in cloth. Nobody breathed. Daniel placed it on a nearby table. Then slowly opened the lid. Inside sat jewelry. Letters. Keepsakes. Photographs. And beneath everything else, one final picture. The room became perfectly silent. Emily carefully lifted it. The photograph had faded with age. But the image remained visible. Richard Carter. Standing beside a young woman. The same woman from Sarah's description. The same woman Elizabeth claimed he was seeing. Except something was wrong. Very wrong. Emily turned the photograph over. A handwritten note covered the back. The handwriting belonged to Richard. The date was clearly visible. 3 years before he ever met Elizabeth Carter. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly the entire lie collapsed. The photograph wasn't evidence of an affair. It couldn't be. The timeline made that impossible. The woman wasn't Elizabeth. She wasn't a secret girlfriend. She wasn't anyone romantic at all. Rebecca stared at the image. Then whispered the answer, "My God." Emily looked up. Rebecca pointed at the woman. "That's his cousin." Silence. Absolute silence. 40 years of silence. 40 years of lies. 40 years of heartbreak. All because of a photograph. A single photograph deliberately stripped of context. Deliberately weaponized. deliberately used to create doubt. Daniel stared at the picture, then at Sarah's journal, then at the inheritance documents sitting nearby. Everything connected. Everything. Elizabeth Carter hadn't created the entire conspiracy. Thomas Brooks still orchestrated the separation. Walter Green still accepted the money. Rebecca still participated in the lies. But Elizabeth had lit the first match, the first deception, the first crack in the foundation, and that crack eventually became a canyon. Emily looked toward the final journal entry, a page written years later, a page Sarah added after discovering the truth. Slowly she began reading. If anyone ever finds this, know that I forgave Richard. The room became silent. Emily continued, none of this was his fault. We were lied to, both of us. The handwriting grew shakier, older, wiser. I spent years angry, years blaming him. I wish I had spent those years searching instead. Daniel closed his eyes. Emily kept reading. If Richard ever learns the truth, tell him I loved him until the very end. The room felt impossibly quiet. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the page. Simple, heartbreaking, and beautiful. Tell Daniel the same thing. Nobody spoke. Not for a very long time. Because there was nothing left to say. The mystery was over. The truth had finally been found. Not inside the will. Not inside the money. Not inside the inheritance. Inside a photograph. The very thing that had started everything. The very thing that had destroyed everything. And somehow, the very thing that finally brought the truth back to life. Months later, the lawsuits ended. Daniel inherited the estate exactly as Richard intended. Not because he won. Not because anyone lost. Because everyone finally understood why. Richard wasn't choosing one family over another. He was apologizing for time that could never be returned. Emily never challenged the decision. Neither did Michael after learning the truth. The siblings remained part of Daniel's life. Not immediately. Not perfectly. Families rarely work that way. But gradually. One conversation at a time. One holiday at a time. One memory at a time. The stranger became a brother. The mystery became history. And Richard Carter's final wish finally came true. His family learned the truth. All of it. Even the parts that hurt. Especially those parts. Because sometimes the truth doesn't heal old wounds. Sometimes it simply explains them. And after 40 years, that was enough. After hearing the entire story, do you think Richard was right to leave everything to Daniel? Or should the inheritance have been divided equally among all of his children? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.